Hey guys, tonight we're easing into a story that looks calm on the surface but absolutely isn't. Because you're about to spend the night on the open plains, and you probably won't survive this if you make the wrong choices. You're standing under a massive sky, the kind that feels endless and welcoming at first. And that's exactly how it tricks you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know what city you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're out on the American frontier, late 1800s, somewhere between the Missouri River and the Rockies. During the day, the prairie rolls gently, covered in waist-high grass that whispers in the wind. The sky is a flawless blue bowl. There are no mountains to warn you, no forests to block what's coming. That openness feels freeing until it doesn't. Because here, weather doesn't arrive gradually. It attacks. One moment you're hauling water or checking a fence line. The next, the wind shifts. It's subtle at first, just a sharper edge to the air against your cheeks. Then the temperature drops so fast your lungs sting when you breathe. Clouds smear across the sky like dirty wool, and the horizon disappears. You don't see the storm coming because there's nothing tall enough to mark its approach. That's your first mistake, thinking you'll see danger before it reaches you. This is the reality pioneers faced when they pushed west under the Homestead Act of 1862, a real historical fact that promised 160 acres to anyone willing to live on and improve the land. The government brochures talked about opportunity. They didn't talk much about winter. Many settlers came from wooded regions or European villages where cold was manageable and shelter was abundant. Out here, trees are scarce, sometimes non-existent for miles. Wood has to be hauled at great cost, and stone is rare. You've claimed land, but the land hasn't agreed to protect you. Your first winter on the plains is a shock that rewires your understanding of cold. This isn't just snow falling quietly from the sky. This is wind-driven ice that slices through wool coats and seeps into bone. Temperatures plunge well below zero, and the wind chill, though the term won't be coined for decades, can kill exposed skin in minutes. You learn quickly that snow isn't the enemy. Wind is. Wind steals heat, erases tracks, and turns familiar ground into a blank, lethal maze. You try building above ground first, of course, everyone does. A simple wooden cabin, maybe even a sodden wood hybrid if you're clever. But the wind finds every crack. Snow piles against the walls, forcing itself inside as fine, icy dust. At night, the walls groan. Your breath fogs the air, and frost creeps across the interior like lace. You pile on blankets, huddle close to a small stove, and still wake up shivering. Here's a quirky but true detail. Ink sometimes froze solid in pioneer homes during severe cold snaps, forcing people to warm their inkwells under their arms just to write a letter. That's how thin the line is between daily life and pure survival. As storms worsen, you start noticing something interesting. Animals don't fight the plains the way humans do. Prairie dogs vanish underground, foxes disappear into dens, even livestock instinctively press low, turning their backs to the wind or seeking shallow depressions in the earth. The ground, you realise, doesn't change temperature as violently as the air. 6 feet down, it's almost calm, almost warm. That observation plants a dangerous but necessary idea in your mind. At night, as the wind howls like something alive, you start digging. Not a tunnel, at least not yet, but a cut into a hillside or a shallow pit reinforced with whatever you have. Sod blocks come up thick and heavy, woven with roots that make them surprisingly strong. The earth smells damp and organic, a scent that feels comforting compared to the sterile bite of frozen air above. There's an ongoing scholarly debate among historians about how quickly settlers adopted underground or semi-underground living. Some argue it was a desperate last resort, used only after catastrophic storms proved cabins inadequate. Others believe many pioneers planned sod or dugout homes from the start, fully aware of the climate through Indigenous knowledge and early survey reports. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, part preparation, part hard-earned lesson. As you dig, your hands go numb, your breath comes out in harsh clouds, but something changes when you step into that shallow earthen space for the first time. The wind vanishes, the temperature evens out. It's not warm exactly, but it's survivable. The silence is startling, broken only by the muffled roar of the storm above you, like thunder heard through layers of soil. This is the moment you understand that survival here isn't about conquering the land, it's about hiding from it. You lie awake that night, pressed against dirt walls, listening to the storm rage overhead. Snow piles up higher and higher, erasing the world you knew just hours ago. Above ground, fences vanish, paths disappear. Entire landmarks cease to exist. But down here, underground, time slows. The earth holds steady, ancient and indifferent, offering just enough mercy to let you see morning. As your breathing evens out, a strange realization settles in. You didn't come west to live underground. But if you want to live at all, this may be the only way forward. And as terrifying as that thought is, it's also oddly comforting, because for the first time since the storm began, you feel like you might actually make it through the night. Morning doesn't arrive the way you expect it to. There's no pink sunrise, no gentle thaw. You wake underground to a dim, brownish half-light filtering through the doorway you packed with blankets and boards. The storm hasn't ended, it's just paused, like a predator catching its breath. When you press your palm against the dirt wall beside you, it feels cool but steady, almost patient. Above you, the prairie is still trying to kill you. You crawl out briefly to check the damage, shielding your face from the wind. The world is unrecognizable. Snow has flattened the grass into a single white plain, and the sky blends seamlessly into the ground. You can't tell where you are relative to anything else. This is one of the deadliest truths of the plains. Without trees, hills, or buildings, direction disappears the moment weather turns hostile. People freeze to death just yards from safety because they walk in circles, convinced they're moving straight. That's why so many settlers died their first winter. Not from starvation or wolves, but from exposure and disorientation. It's a historical fact that winter mortality rates spiked dramatically among new homesteaders during their first 2 years on the plains, especially during severe storm seasons in the 1870s and 1880s. Experience, more than equipment, was the difference between life and death. You retreat underground quickly, sealing yourself back into the earth. The contrast is immediate. Down here, the wind can't find you. Snow can pile up for days, even weeks, and it won't matter much as long as your air holds and your roof doesn't collapse. The ground is doing what no cabin ever could, buffering reality. You start to understand why trees matter so much to human settlement. Back east, forests broke the wind, provided fuel, offered material for sturdy homes. Out here, trees exist mostly in memory and rumour. You burn dried buffalo chips instead of firewood, a practice borrowed from earlier travellers and native tribes. They don't burn hot or clean, but they burn long enough to heat a small space. The smell is unforgettable. Here's a quirky frontier detail that sounds exaggerated but isn't. Some settlers could tell how severe a winter storm was by how quickly their buffalo chip fires went out, because damp snow blowing down ventilation holes would kill the flame. Fire behaviour became a weather forecast. You spend the day improving your underground shelter, digging deeper, reinforcing the ceiling with sod blocks laid like bricks, grass side down so roots knit together as they freeze. Every movement is slow, deliberate, because sweat is dangerous. Damp clothes steal heat fast. You learn to work in short bursts, resting often, letting your body stay dry. The sod house, or dugout as many call it, starts to feel less like a cave and more like a bunker. It's dark, yes, cramped. Earth falls from the ceiling sometimes, sprinkling your hair and shoulders. Insects will come later when things warm. But right now, it's quiet, and quiet means alive. There's an ongoing debate among historians and environmental scholars about whether sod and underground homes were actually healthier than wooden cabins. Some argue the constant dampness led to respiratory illness, mold exposure, and parasites. Others counter that sod homes provided more consistent warmth, reduced frostbite, and may have prevented the deadly nighttime hypothermia common in drafty cabins. Records are spotty, because many who didn't survive never left journals behind. As the storm stretches into a second day, you realise this isn't temporary discomfort. This is a test of endurance. Food becomes ritualised. You ration carefully, chewing slowly, listening to the muffled storm above. Every sound matters. A shift in wind direction. The soft thump of snow sliding off the roof. The faint whistle of air moving through your ventilation hole. A hole you check obsessively, because blocked airflow means death by suffocation, not cold. You start keeping the hole open with a stick, pushing upward every few hours to clear snow. Some pioneers used stovepipes or hollowed logs for this purpose. Others weren't so lucky. Entire families were found in spring, preserved by cold, having suffocated quietly while buried beneath drifts taller than houses. Time behaves strangely underground. Without daylight cues, hours blur. You sleep in fragments. You dream intensely of open fields of warmth, of soundless white emptiness. When you wake, you sometimes forget where you are, panic flaring around, or you touch the dirt wall and remember why it's there. Above you, the plains are erasing human presence. Roads vanish, fence posts disappear, even rivers freeze solid, becoming indistinguishable from land. This is why mail delivery stopped for weeks at a time, and why isolated homesteads sometimes went an entire winter without seeing another person. The land didn't just isolate you physically, it erased you socially. You think about the promises that brought you here. Free land, independence, a future. None of those promises mentioned digging into frozen soil just to breathe safely. Yet here you are, learning that survival isn't heroic. It's repetitive. It's boring. It's clearing snow from a hole every few hours so you don't die quietly in your sleep. By the third night, the storm finally weakens. The wind drops from a scream to a low moan. Snow still falls, but gently now, almost politely. When you emerge, the world feels hushed, stunned by its own violence. The cold is sharper after confinement, but you're alive, and you know deep down that if you'd stayed above ground, trusted walls and roofs alone, you probably wouldn't be. You stand there surrounded by endless white and understand something fundamental about this place. The prairie doesn't reward bravery, it rewards humility. It favours those willing to disappear when necessary, to go underground, to wait, to let the storm pass without challenging it. As you duck back into your shelter one last time to rest, a strange sense of gratitude settles in. The earth didn't welcome you. It didn't care about you at all, but it let you borrow its steadiness for a few crucial days, and on the plains, that's the closest thing to kindness you'll ever get. When the storm finally releases its grip, you don't feel relief right away. What you feel is exposure. Stepping back onto the open prairie after days underground is like walking onto another planet. The light is blinding, bouncing off snow that stretches uninterrupted to the horizon. Sound behaves oddly. Your footsteps crunch too loudly, then seem to vanish into the air. The land feels emptied, scraped clean of all the little markers that once made it familiar. You realise that surviving the storm was only half the challenge. Now you have to function again. This is where the first true winter shock sets in, the kind no guidebook prepared you for. Cold, you're learning, isn't a single sensation. It's layers of problems stacked on top of each other. There's the cold that bites your skin, the cold that stiffens your joints, and the deeper cold that makes thinking feel slow and distant. You catch yourself standing still too long, staring at nothing, until instinct kicks in and you force yourself to move. Historically, many pioneers underestimated this phase, the aftermath. Journals from the Great Plains describe people surviving blizzards, only to suffer severe frostbite while attempting routine chores afterward. Fingers blacken, toes go numb forever. A documented fact from frontier medical records shows that amputations due to frostbite were common even when no injury occurred, just prolonged exposure during cleanup and recovery. You head towards what used to be your cabin, or at least you think that's where it was. Snowdrifts have swallowed the lower half of the structure, and the roof groans under uneven weight. You dig carefully, because collapse is a real danger now. Sod roofs, especially, can become waterlogged and heavy once snow begins to melt and refreeze. Some pioneers lost their shelters days after storms ended, crushed not by weather, but by gravity catching up. That's another reason underground spaces mattered. Dugouts rarely collapsed outward. The earth pressed in evenly, holding itself in place. Above-ground homes, especially hastily built ones, were far less forgiving. As you work, you think back to your arrival on the plains months ago, when winter felt abstract. You remember laughing nervously at stories told by older settlers, stories about storms that screamed like living things, about snow that buried fence posts and livestock alike. You assumed they were exaggerating, everyone does. The plains have a way of punishing that assumption quickly. There's a quirky, unsettling detail buried in some pioneer letters. During especially harsh winters, people reported hearing sounds underground, knocks, creaks, even what they described as voices. Modern scholars believe these were likely caused by shifting frozen soil, contracting wood, and wind travelling through ventilation shafts. But when you're half-starved, sleep-deprived and isolated, your brain fills in gaps creatively. Fear becomes imaginative. You clear a path between your dugout and the remains of your cabin, packing snow down deliberately so you don't lose it again. Losing your bearings is still a threat even after the storm passes. Whiteout conditions don't need active snowfall. All it takes is flat light and a uniform landscape. People vanished like this, stepping out to fetch water, misjudging distance and never returning. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the psychological impact of these winters was as damaging as the physical one. Some historians argue that isolation, darkness and confinement contributed to depression, anxiety, and what we'd now call seasonal affective disorder. Others caution against projecting modern diagnoses backward, suggesting that communal resilience, routine and religious faith buffered many settlers from long-term mental collapse. Reading the fragmented diaries left behind, it's hard to tell who endured quietly and who simply stopped writing. You return underground as night approaches, because you've learnt the most important lesson already. Don't challenge the temperature drop after sunset. Inside your earthen shelter, the air feels familiar now. You make small improvements. Better door seal, a raised sleeping platform to avoid cold pooling near the floor. These adjustments seem minor, but they stack the odds in your favour. Food becomes a central concern. Supplies don't magically reappear once a storm ends. Hunting is nearly impossible when animals hunker down or migrate. Some pioneers survived weeks on little more than flour, lard and coffee. There are recorded cases, grim but true, of families boiling leather harnesses to extract minimal nutrition. That's not legend, that's desperation. You ration carefully, listening to the subtle drip of melting snow somewhere above. Water is abundant now, but fuel is not. Every fire must justify itself. You burn just enough to cook, just enough to keep the chill from turning dangerous. The rest of the time you rely on insulation and stillness. Stillness becomes a skill. You learn how to sit without fidgeting, how to breathe shallowly to conserve warmth, how to wrap yourself so no skin is exposed. These aren't heroic techniques, they're animal ones, and that realization that you are not separate from the survival rules governing everything else on the plains settles in quietly. You think about native tribes who lived here long before homesteads dotted the land. Many used earth lodges, partially underground, with central fire pits and carefully designed ventilation. Settlers often dismissed indigenous architecture as primitive, only to adopt similar designs under pressure. There's debate among historians about how much direct knowledge transfer occurred versus parallel problem solving. But the result is undeniable. Underground living wasn't innovation, it was rediscovery. As the days pass, winter doesn't loosen its hold. It never really does. Storms come in waves, some small, some brutal. Each time you retreat underground more confidently, sealing yourself in with a practiced efficiency. Fear doesn't vanish, but it becomes manageable, familiar. One night, as wind hums faintly above, you realise something unsettling but empowering. You're no longer reacting blindly. You're anticipating. You know when to dig in and when to emerge. You know which sounds mean danger and which mean nothing at all. The land hasn't softened, but you've adapted. That's the real shock of the first winter. Not that it nearly kills you, but that it changes you. You arrived thinking survival meant endurance. You're learning it actually means cooperation. With the ground, with the weather, with your own limitations. Underground, wrapped in earth and silence, you're not conquering the frontier. You're negotiating with it. By the time the next storm announces itself, you recognise the signs before the sky fully commits. The air goes strangely still, like the prairie is holding its breath. The horizon blurs, not with snow yet, but with a dull metallic haze that flattens distance. Birds vanish. Even the wind seems uncertain for a moment, as if deciding which direction to attack from. You don't wait this time. Experience has made you cautious, and caution keeps you alive. You secure everything quickly, moving with an efficiency that would have felt impossible weeks ago. Tools go underground, food gets stacked high and sealed tight. You clear the ventilation shaft, mark it carefully, and reinforce the roof with another layer of sod. This is what survival looks like now, preparation without drama. The storm hasn't arrived yet, but you're already below ground, listening. When it hits, it's worse than the last one. The wind doesn't howl so much as roar, a constant pressure that vibrates through the soil. Snow hammers the surface above, packing down into a dense, suffocating weight. You feel it through the walls like distant thunder trapped in slow motion. This is a blizzard that doesn't just obscure the world, it erases it. Historically, these were called ground blizzards, a term used on the plains to describe storms where little or no new snow fell, but existing snow was lifted and driven by winds so violently that visibility dropped to zero. They were among the deadliest events settlers faced, because people underestimated them. You could step outside under clear skies and still be blinded within seconds. You stay underground for days. Time blurs again, but differently now. You're not panicking, you're waiting. The earth holds steady at a temperature just above freezing, while above the air swings wildly. This thermal stability is the entire reason underground shelter works. Modern measurements confirm that soil just a few feet down maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, something pioneers learned through trial, error, and survival. Here's a strange but real frontier habit. Some settlers hung strips of cloth or ribbons near their ventilation holes. If the fabric stopped fluttering, it meant airflow was blocked by snow, and action was needed immediately. It was a crude but effective early warning system against suffocation. You check your airflow obsessively. Snow has a way of creeping, compacting, sealing gaps without warning. You push the pole upward every few hours, clearing the shaft, listening for the satisfying rush of cold air. Each time it feels like borrowing another slice of time from the storm. Inside, the space feels smaller with each passing hour, not physically, mentally. This is where the real strain sets in. Darkness presses in. Silence becomes loud. Your thoughts echo too clearly. You replay old conversations, old mistakes. The mind, deprived of novelty, starts to gnaw on itself. There's an ongoing debate among frontier historians about how people coped psychologically with this level of isolation. Some point to storytelling, prayer, and routine as anchors of sanity. Others highlight breakdowns. Accounts of settlers talking to walls, refusing to emerge even after storms passed, or developing an intense fear of open spaces. The truth is probably uncomfortable. Some adapted, some fractured, and many left no record of either. You tell yourself stories quietly, not for entertainment, but for structure. You mark days by meals, by airflow checks, by the changing sound of wind above. You sleep sitting up sometimes, wrapped tightly because lying flat makes the cold feel heavier. Your body adjusts, conserving energy in ways you don't consciously control. At one point, the storm shifts direction. You feel it instantly. The pressure on one wall lessens while another deepens. Snow slides. Something thumps above, maybe a sod block settling, maybe part of the surface collapsing inward. Your heart spikes, but the ceiling holds. Earth distributes weight differently than wood ever could. That knowledge calms you just enough. When you finally emerge, it's into a world transformed again. Drifts tower higher than before, sculpted into sharp ridges by relentless wind. Familiar shapes are gone. Your cabin roof barely peeks out, a dark line beneath white. You dig carefully, because tunnels collapse easily when temperatures fluctuate. You find tracks frozen mid-step, your own, preserved like fossils. They remind you how thin the margin is between motion and stillness out here. People froze standing upright, caught by sudden gusts that dropped temperatures so fast their muscles locked. That's not folklore, it's documented. And you think about how many lives these storms took, not because people were weak, but because they were exposed. Underground, exposure loses its power. You can't see the storm, you can't fight it, you can only wait it out. There's a grim, quirky detail from this era. Some settlers described emerging after long blizzards with beards and eyelashes frozen into solid white masses, only to feel oddly disappointed when they melted. Proof in a way that the storm was real, that it had substance. As you clear snow and check for damage, you realise how completely your relationship with the land has changed. The surface is no longer your home. It's a workspace, a risk zone. Safety lives below. You don't romanticize it. Underground life is uncomfortable, claustrophobic, and often terrifying. But it works. It keeps you alive when everything else fails. And slowly, quietly, across the plains, thousands of pioneers are learning the same lesson at the same time, independently, desperately. The prairie doesn't adapt to you. You adapt to it, or you disappear. As you duck back underground while the light fades, you understand that hiding isn't cowardice. Here. It's wisdom passed along by wind, snow, and the unforgiving math of heat loss. After enough storm, you stop thinking of winter as a season and start thinking of it as a presence. It waits. Even on calm days, even when the sun glints harmlessly off the snow, you feel it hovering just beyond the edge of things. That awareness changes how you move. You no longer wander far without reason. Every trip above ground has a purpose, a time limit, an exit plan already rehearsed in your head. This is when you truly understand that wind, not snow, is the real killer out here. Snow can bury, yes, but wind strips heat from the body with ruthless efficiency. You've felt it slice through layers of wool, steal warmth faster than your body can replace it. A still day at 10 below feels survivable. A windy day at the same temperature feels lethal. The difference isn't subtle, it's the difference between discomfort and collapse. Modern science would later explain this with wind chill calculations, but you don't need equations. You've watched water freeze mid-pour. You've felt exposed skin go numb in seconds. You've seen how quickly strength drains once shivering turns violent. This is why underground shelter matters so much. The earth doesn't care how fast the wind is moving above it. Down here, that weapon is neutralized. You experiment cautiously with staying above ground longer on calm days, testing your limits. It's tempting, sunlight does strange things to morale, but every time the wind stirs, even slightly, your body tenses. You've learnt the pattern. A breeze becomes a gust becomes a wall. The prairie escalates without warning. There's a documented historical reality behind this fear. Many fatal winter incidents on the plains occurred during relatively short trips, checking livestock, fetching water, walking between buildings. People didn't die in epic struggles against blizzards. They died doing ordinary things while underestimating wind exposure. That knowledge hangs over every step you take now. You start modifying your underground space further, shaping it not just as a shelter, but as a system. You deepen the floor slightly so cold air settles away from where you sleep. You angle the entrance to block direct wind. You line parts of the wall with scrap fabric, sacks, anything that adds another insulating layer. It's imperfect, but it helps. Here's a strange, almost humorous frontier detail. Some settlers measured the severity of winter by how long it took bread to freeze solid after baking. In underground homes, bread stayed soft far longer than in cabins. It became a point of pride, and a quiet proof that dirt walls beat wooden ones. You're not alone in this realization. Word spread slowly across the plains, through travellers, letters, rare visits. People trade tips, how deep to dig, how thick the sod should be, how to prevent ceiling drip when temperatures fluctuate. There's no manual, just shared trial and error. Entire communities begin to look different. Homes half swallowed by the land, chimneys barely visible above snowdrifts. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these adaptations represent resilience or failure. Some historians argue that underground living symbolized defeat, a retreat from the promise of civilized settlement. Others see it as one of the most practical architectural responses to an extreme environment, a temporary phase that allowed permanent settlement to take root. Standing here, well, crouching here, you know which side you'd choose. As winter deepens, the wind sculpts the landscape into something alien. Snow forms hard ridges, sharp as stone. Drifts become walls. In places, the wind scours the ground bare, exposing frozen grass and soil like wounds. Travel becomes nearly impossible. When you do venture out, you follow the same packed paths repeatedly, because creating new ones costs too much energy. You learn to read wind the way sailors read water. Subtle shifts in sound tell you when it's strengthening. A change in how smoke behaves warns you of turbulence. When smoke refuses to rise and instead flattens along the ground, you retreat underground without hesitation. That's a sign old-timers swear by, and now you do too. One night the wind grows so intense that it seems to press you deeper into the earth. You feel it as pressure, not noise, a constant force leaning against the land. Your ventilation cloth flutters wildly, then settles into a steady rhythm. You check it again and again, because if that movement stops, everything stops. This kind of storm strips the world of smell and sound above ground. But below, sensory details sharpen. You notice the earthy scent of damp soil, the way the air feels heavier but calmer, the quiet creak of sod adjusting to stress. These details ground you, literally and mentally. There's a fringe belief recorded in some pioneer accounts that living underground changed people, made them more cautious, more inward. Some even claimed it sharpened intuition, that you could feel storms before they arrived. While there's no evidence of anything mystical, modern psychology does suggest that heightened environmental awareness develops under constant threat. You're not predicting storms, you're noticing patterns you once ignored. As weeks pass, your underground shelter becomes less of a refuge and more of a baseline. Above ground is the exception now, a place you visit briefly, never fully trusting. That shift is subtle but profound. It marks the moment you stop seeing yourself as a temporary visitor to the plains and start acting like someone who intends to survive them. When the wind finally eases again, it leaves behind a landscape reshaped, but familiar in its danger. You emerge cautiously, scanning the horizon. The sky's clear, brutally blue. It's beautiful in a way that feels almost offensive, given what just happened. You take a deep breath, lungs stinging, and then retreat once more into the earth, not because you have to, but because you choose to. Because you understand now that survival here isn't about defying nature's power. It's about stepping out of its way when it decides to show you exactly how strong it is. Underground, wrapped in dirt and quiet, you wait. And waiting, you've learned, is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. At some point, the cold stops surprising you. That doesn't mean it weakens, it just becomes predictable in its cruelty. You wake each day expecting resistance from the world above, expecting effort to cost more than it should. This is the stage where many cabins fail outright, not from a single dramatic storm, but from accumulated stress. Nails loosen, boards warp, roofs sag under alternating cycles of snow, melt, and refreeze. You watch it happen to your own above-ground structure, piece by piece. Wood, you learn, is a poor negotiator with winter when it stands alone. It shrinks, cracks, and creates gaps no amount of stuffing can fully seal, and exploits those weaknesses mercilessly. Underground, the earth shifts too, but slowly, evenly. There are no sudden betrayals, no sharp drafts sneaking in through invisible seams. That consistency becomes priceless. Historically, many settlers abandoned cabins midwinter after realizing they were losing heat faster than they could replace it. There are recorded accounts of families moving their stoves underground, dismantling their own homes to feed fires in dugouts below. It wasn't a symbolic act, it was triage. You do something similar, salvaging what you can. Planks become ceiling supports. A door becomes a windbreak at the entrance. Nothing goes to waste now. Every object has one purpose: keep heat where your body is. The rest of the world can freeze as much as it wants. There's a quirky but well-documented detail from this era. Some sod houses grew grass on their roofs in spring, complete with wildflowers. While it sounds charming, in winter that same living roof acted as insulation, trapping heat below and anchoring snow in place so it didn't scour the surface away. Beauty was accidental. Function came first. You notice how sound behaves differently underground. Above ground, wind dominates everything. Below you hear subtle things, the crack of frozen soil, the faint drip of meltwater, even your own heartbeat when the space is quiet enough. That awareness keeps you alert. It also keeps you sane. Silence with texture is easier to endure than silence without it. The cold forces difficult choices. Washing becomes rare. Clothes stiffen with use, smelling of smoke and earth. You rotate layers carefully, drying them slowly near the fire, because wet fabric is a liability. Frostbite doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in while you're distracted, while you think you're managing just fine. Medical knowledge on the frontier is limited, but people learn fast through observation. You know to rub frozen skin gently, never aggressively. You know that numbness is more dangerous than pain. These lessons spread through communities quietly, often after someone loses fingers or toes. Survival knowledge here is communal, whether people admit it or not. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how quickly these informal networks formed on the plains. Some argue that isolation dominated, that homesteads were too scattered for meaningful exchange. Others point to shared infrastructure, post offices, supply routes, churches, as hubs where vital information travelled. From your perspective, any knowledge that arrives in time to matter feels miraculous. You start hearing about entire settlements adapting underground. Not just individual families, but clusters of homes dug into south-facing hillsides, entrances sheltered from prevailing winds. In some places, towns looked abandoned in winter, chimneys barely visible, smoke rising from holes in the snow. Life continued beneath the surface, invisible but persistent. One unsettling rumour circulates. During particularly harsh winters, wolves followed storms, drawn by weakened livestock and human scent. Whether exaggerated or not, it reinforces your instinct to minimise surface exposure. Underground, scent disperses differently. Noise doesn't carry, you feel less like prey. You adjust your daily rhythm to the underground world. Sleep comes earlier. Waking comes without light. You mark time by tasks instead of hours. Clear the vent, check the roof supports, melt snow, eat, rest, repeat. It's monotonous, but monotony is stability, and stability is survival. There's a fringe theory in some historical writing that underground living altered family dynamics, forcing constant proximity that either strengthened bonds or shattered them. Without privacy, small tensions magnified. Some families emerged from winter closer, others fractured. Alone you experience a different version of this. Your thoughts are your only company, and they're not always friendly. To manage that, you develop rituals. You tell yourself stories aloud, you recite memories in detail, anchoring them so that they don't blur. This isn't entertainment, it's orientation. Losing track of yourself is just as dangerous as losing track of the weather. When you do venture above ground now, it's brief and purposeful. The cold hits harder each time, like it's offended you left shelter at all. But you move confidently because you know exactly where safety is. You've built it, dug it, reinforced it with patience and fear. As another storm gathers in the distance, you don't feel dread the way you once did. You feel readiness. The earth waits for you, unchanged, reliable. You sit back underground as wind rises, sealing yourself in with practiced ease. This is the moment you realise something fundamental. The Wild West wasn't conquered by guns or grit alone. It was survived through adaptation, through the willingness to live differently than planned, to let go of comfort, and, when necessary, to disappear beneath the surface until the world above calmed down. The animals notice your change before you fully do. Livestock that once paced nervously in open pens now cluster instinctively near the earthworks you've built, pressing their bodies against sod walls, lowering their heads into the lee of the ground. Even the wild creatures behave differently. You spot fewer shapes moving across the snow, fewer tracks cutting blindly into the wind. The plains feel quieter, but not calmer. More like everything living here has agreed to stay low and conserve energy. Watching them, it finally clicks. Animals don't treat winter as something to push through. They treat it as something to hide from. That realization reshapes how you think about survival out here. You stop seeing underground shelter as a clever trick and start seeing it as a basic rule of the ecosystem. Those who burrow live, those who don't, often don't. There's a solid historical reason this mattered. Settlers who lost livestock to winter storms often didn't recover financially, even if they themselves survived. Animals were heat, food, labour and insurance all in one. Many pioneers brought smaller animals, chickens, goats, even calves into their dugouts during the worst storms. It sounds chaotic, but body heat mattered. A few degrees could mean the difference between life and death. Here's a strange but documented frontier detail. Some families slept alongside calves or lambs during blizzards, wrapping them in blankets and using them as living heat sources. It wasn't sentimentality. It was thermodynamics. Warm bodies stabilize temperature in enclosed spaces. You experiment cautiously with this idea, sheltering one animal at a time when conditions demand it. The smell is intense, the noise is constant, but the air feels warmer, less brittle. You begin to understand why barns in colder regions were often built partially underground or banked with earth. It's the same principle, just stripped of ornament. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how much settlers consciously copied animal behaviour versus stumbling into similar solutions independently. Some argue that pioneers observed wildlife closely and adapted deliberately. Others suggest desperation led everyone to the same conclusions eventually. From where you sit, pressed against dirt, listening to wind scrape the surface, it doesn't matter. The result is the same. You're living the way the land demands. Storms continue to arrive in unpredictable waves. Some are brief, sharp assaults that leave quickly. Others linger, grinding down patience and supplies. You learn to judge them by sound now. A high, whistling pitch means drifting snow and blocked vents. A low, constant roar means pressure and cold that will last. Each sound has its own response drilled into you. You hear stories, when stories manage to travel, of people who didn't adapt. Of families found frozen inside cabins, beds arranged neatly, firewood stacked just out of reach. Of travellers who tried to outrun storms and lost. These stories aren't told dramatically, they are told quietly, like warnings that don't need emphasis. Psychologically, something shifts in you during this period. Fear becomes background noise. It doesn't vanish, but it stops driving every decision. In its place comes calculation. How much fuel remains, how long food will last, whether the ground feels too damp today. You stop asking, will I survive, and start asking, what keeps the system working? Scholars still debate whether this mental shift represents resilience or emotional numbing. Some view it as healthy adaptation, a necessary recalibration in extreme environments. Others suggest it exacted a long-term cost, dulling emotional range and increasing isolation. The diaries that survive show both outcomes, often within the same person, just weeks apart. You notice your sense of time stretching. Days feel long underground, but weeks vanish quickly. The outside world shrinks to brief glimpses. Grey light, cutting cold, a few necessary tasks. Inside, routine rules everything. Humans are remarkably good at turning repetition into comfort when the alternative is chaos. You start improving your shelter not just for survival, but for efficiency. You carve small storage niches into the walls. You raise your sleeping platform higher. You adjust the entrance angle again, shaving inches here and there until drafts weaken. Each improvement feels like reclaiming a little agency from the weather. There's another quirky frontier fact that circulates. Some settlers swore that underground homes stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter, making them superior year-round. While romanticised, there's truth there. Earth-sheltered structures moderate temperature swings naturally. Modern architecture would later rediscover this, but out here it's learned through necessity. You begin to understand why some people never returned fully above ground, even when conditions improved. Comfort rewires expectation. Once you know what stable warmth feels like, drafty cabins seem reckless. Civilization, you realise, isn't defined by height or visibility, it's defined by control over environment. And underground you finally have some. One evening, as wind rattles the surface lightly, you sit in near darkness and listen to your own breathing. It's steady, calm. That alone feels like an accomplishment. Weeks ago, every storm spiked your pulse. Now the earth absorbs the violence, leaving you with muted echoes instead of direct assault. You think again about the idea of bravery. The frontier myths talk about standing tall against nature, about facing storms head-on. But none of the graves scattered across these plains belong to people who hid wisely. They belong to people who misjudged exposure, timing, or pride. Underground, there's no room for pride, the ceiling is too low for that. There's only space for function, for patience, for listening. As another storm approaches, and you know it's coming long before the sky confirms it, you don't rush or panic. You finish your tasks, you check your systems, you settle in. The earth closes around you like a held breath. And for once you feel aligned with the rhythm of this place instead of fighting it. This isn't how you imagined frontier life, but it's how frontier life actually works. Survival here isn't loud or glorious. It's quiet, buried and deliberate, learned from animals, reinforced by loss and perfected one storm at a time. By now, going underground no longer feels like an emergency measure. It feels like architecture. The space has a logic to it that your original cabin never achieved. Every curve, every low ceiling and narrow passage serves a purpose. Heat stays where you need it. Wind is forced to give up. Sound is softened into something manageable. What once felt like hiding now feels like designing your life around the only constant the plains truly offer: instability. You notice how your body responds differently underground. Muscles stay looser, breathing slows. You don't burn calories fighting drafts or tension. That matters more than you expected. Calories are survival currency here. Waste them and winter collects interest fast. Down here, your body works with the environment instead of against it. This is the revelation many settlers came to independently. Sod houses and dugouts weren't just shelters of last resort. They were energy-saving devices. A historical fact buried in agricultural reports from the late 19th century shows that families living in earth-sheltered homes used significantly less fuel during winter than those in wooden cabins. Less fuel meant fewer trips outside. Fewer trips meant fewer chances to freeze. The first time you truly appreciate this is during a long, dull stretch between storms. The sky stays grey, the temperature never rises enough to feel forgiving, but it also doesn't plunge into immediate danger. This is the kind of weather that tempts people into complacency. They linger outside too long. They try to get things done. That's when mistakes happen. You don't linger anymore. You do what's necessary and return underground. The ground temperature doesn't care about overcast skies or false hope. It stays steady, almost stubbornly so. That steadiness becomes your anchor. There's a strange, almost comforting sensory detail to sod walls that people rarely mention. They smell alive, damp, grassy, earthy. Not pleasant exactly, but grounding. It's a smell that doesn't change much, and in a world where everything else does, that constancy matters. Some settlers wrote that the smell reminded them they were still connected to the land, not merely surviving on top of it. Of course, underground life isn't without problems. Moisture is constant. Condensation forms where warm breath meets cold soil. You manage it by scraping walls, improving airflow, adjusting where you sleep. Mold becomes a concern as winter drags on, especially during brief thaws. There's an open scholarly debate about how much chronic illness resulted from this dampness, versus how much illness was simply the cost of frontier life in general. Records blur cause and effect, and you adapt anyway, because adaptation is the only option the plains ever offer. Another storm rolls in quietly this time. No dramatic build-up, no warning howl, just a gradual tightening of air pressure that makes your ears pop slightly and your thoughts feel heavier. You're underground before the first snow really starts, listening as it layers itself onto the surface above. The sound is soft at first, almost gentle. Then the wind arrives and everything hardens. You don't panic, you prepare food, you check airflow, you settle into routine. This is where underground living truly proves its value, not in dramatic survival moments, but in its ability to turn catastrophe into inconvenience. There's a quirky frontier belief that sod houses were lucky, that lightning struck them less often and storms passed over them more gently. While there's no mystical truth to that, there is physics. Earth-sheltered structures are less exposed, less conductive, less vulnerable. To people living through repeated storms, the difference felt like luck. You think about neighbours you've heard of who refused to adapt, who insisted on keeping their cabins pristine, their lives visible above ground. Some did fine, others didn't. Pride is an expensive resource here. You've learned to spend it sparingly. As the storm drags on, you pass time by reinforcing small weaknesses. A hairline crack gets packed with clay. A loose sod block gets wedged tighter. These aren't grand improvements, but they add up. Survival here isn't about one brilliant solution. It's about 100 small ones layered together. The psychological effect of this kind of living continues to intrigue historians. Some argue that underground life dulled ambition, that it encouraged withdrawal and stagnation. Others suggest it enabled long-term settlement by preserving lives through the harshest years. From your perspective, ambition is meaningless if you're dead. Stability comes first. Everything else waits. You sleep deeply now, even as wind scrapes the surface above. Your dreams are quieter, less frantic. That alone tells you you've crossed some invisible threshold. Fear still exists, but it no longer controls your nights. When the storm finally loosens its grip, you don't rush outside. You wait. Let the wind settle. Let the temperature reveal its true intentions. This patience, this refusal to hurry, is something the ground has taught you. The plains punish haste. Underground living rewards restraint. Eventually, you emerge into a landscape reshaped yet again. Snow piled higher, drift shifted, familiar paths erased and rewritten. You take it in calmly, then start the slow work of adjustment, because you know now that this won't be the last time. As you move, you realize how thoroughly your mindset has changed. You no longer measure success by progress alone. You measure it by continuity. Did you maintain warmth? Did you conserve fuel? Did you avoid unnecessary risk? Underground, those questions have clear answers. Above ground, they rarely do. As night approaches, you return once more to your earthen shelter. You don't think of it as hiding anymore. You think of it as choosing the smartest layer of the world to live in for now. And as the wind begins its familiar low song above, you settle in, confident that the ground will do what it's always done. Hold steady while everything else loses its balance. You start to notice something subtle but profound about the ground beneath you. It doesn't rush. No matter how violently the weather behaves above, the soil responds slowly, thoughtfully, as if time itself moves differently down here. That slowness becomes your greatest ally. While temperatures swing wildly on the surface, plunging at night, teasing warmth by day, the Earth stays almost stubbornly consistent. This is the hidden physics that keeps you alive. A few feet below the prairie, the temperature hovers just above freezing all winter long. You don't know the numbers, of course, but you feel the effect every time you step down into your shelter. The air stops biting. Your breath steadies. This stable thermal mass is why underground shelter works so well. And it's a historical fact later confirmed by soil temperature studies across the Great Plains. Settlers didn't have data, but they had bodies, and bodies noticed the difference immediately. This realization reframes everything. You're no longer just hiding from storms, you're exploiting the planet's natural insulation. The ground absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, smoothing out the extremes that kill people on the surface. In a place defined by extremes, moderation becomes the rarest luxury of all. You make adjustments with this in mind. You deepen part of the floor another few inches, enough to feel the air grow heavier, calmer. Cold air sinks, so you raise your sleeping platform even higher. These choices feel almost scientific now, guided by observation rather than desperation. You're not guessing anymore, you're refining. There's a quirky detail buried in some settler accounts that still surprises historians. People sometimes complain that their dugouts felt too warm during late winter thaws, forcing them to crack entrances open to release heat. That sounds absurd until you understand how efficient Earth insulation can be. When the surface finally warms, the ground releases stored heat upward, creating a brief uncanny comfort underground, while the world above remains frozen and muddy. Of course, that warmth brings its own problems. Thaw means moisture, and moisture is relentless. Water seeps along invisible paths, darkening walls, softening edges. You manage it constantly, redirecting trickles, reinforcing weak spots, reshaping the floor so puddles don't form where you sleep. It's never finished work. It's maintenance as lifestyle. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether sodden dugout living shortened lives through chronic damp exposure or lengthened them by preventing acute cold deaths. Tuberculosis, rheumatism and respiratory illness were common on the frontier, but so was hypothermia. Which threat mattered more is still argued. From where you sit, wrapped in earth, while a storm rages uselessly above, the trade-off feels obvious. You think about neighbours who never made these adjustments, who trusted thin walls and bravado, who believed endurance alone would carry them through. Their absence is quiet but noticeable. Empty claims, unattended fences, silence where smoke once rose. The plains don't memorialise mistakes loudly, they just move on. As winter drags forward, you find yourself oddly grateful for the limitations underground living imposes. The low ceiling discourages wasted motion. The dim light encourages rest. The confined space makes priorities unmistakably clear. Eat, stay warm, breathe. Everything else is optional. Psychologically, this simplicity does something unexpected. It calms you. There's no illusion of control anymore, and that's freeing. You're not trying to dominate the environment. You're cooperating with it at the most basic level. Modern scholars might call this adaptive minimalism. You call it staying alive. You mark time differently now, not by dates, but by changes in the soil. When the walls feel slightly softer, you know a thaw is near. When they harden again, winter has reasserted itself. The ground becomes your calendar, your forecast, your warning system. There's a fringe belief recorded in some frontier communities that people living underground developed a stronger sense of weather, almost like animals. While there's no mystical explanation, constant close contact with the earth likely sharpened awareness of pressure changes, humidity shifts, and subtle temperature gradients. You're not predicting storms. You're feeling their approach through the medium that transmits them most honestly. One night, the temperature above plummets unexpectedly. You know it not by sound, but by stillness. Wind drops, snow stops moving. The air grows dense. This is the kind of cold that kills quickly. Yet underground, nothing changes. The earth buffers the drop, holding on to yesterday's warmth like a secret. You sit there, safe, while exposed life above ground stiffens and cracks. That's when the full weight of the lesson settles in. Survival here isn't about strength or speed, it's about placement. Being in the right layer of the world at the right time. You imagine future generations looking back on this period, romanticizing the frontier with stories of grit and defiance. They'll talk about blizzards and bravery, about men standing tall against the wind. They'll mention sod houses as curiosities, footnotes. They won't feel what you feel now, the relief of stepping below the surface, the instant softening of danger, the way fear loosens its grip when the ground closes around you. As winter inches toward its long-awaited end, you know you'll eventually return above ground more often. Crops will need planting. Life will expand outward again. But something fundamental has shifted. You'll never fully trust the surface the way you once did. You'll always know where the earth waits, steady and patient. For now, as another cold night settles over the plains, you choose the deeper quiet. You lower yourself into the dugout, seal the entrance, and let the storm waste itself overhead. Down here, time stretches gently. The ground holds its temperature. Your breath fogs less. Your heart slows. The prairie can rage all it wants. You've learned where its anger loses strength. And wrapped in soil and silence you rest, not because the danger is gone, but because you finally understand how to step aside and let it pass. By late winter, your hands know the shape of the underground space better than your eyes ever did. You move through it instinctively, ducking without thinking, reaching for tools in the dim without searching. Muscle memory replaces light. This is the point where survival stops feeling like a series of emergencies and starts feeling like a craft. One learned slowly, imperfectly, but well enough to trust. You remember how frantic the digging felt at the beginning. The panic, the cold snapping at your fingers while you carved into frozen soil, with no real plan beyond get below the wind. Now, the work is different. When you dig, you do it deliberately. You brace walls before they fail. You shave ceilings instead of hacking them. Every scoop of earth has intention behind it, because you've learned the consequences of carelessness. There's a historical truth buried in homesteader accounts. Many dugouts were expanded over time, evolving from crude emergency shelters into complex underground homes with multiple chambers, storage areas, sleeping alcoves, even shallow root cellars carved deeper, where temperatures stayed most stable. What began as desperation slowly turned into design. You find yourself doing the same. One afternoon, during a lull between storms, you deepen a small side niche to store food farther from heat and moisture. Another day, you adjust the entrance tunnel slightly downward so cold air settles before reaching the main room. These are small changes, but they stack together like armour. Working underground in winter teaches patience the hard way. You can't rush. Sweat is dangerous. Overexertion leads to damp clothes, and damp clothes steal heat mercilessly. So you work in bursts, rest, work again. The rhythm is slow, almost meditative. Dig, schalke, bathe, listen. Check pull the walls, repeat. Here's a quirky but genuine detail from frontier life. Some settlers sharpened their tools differently for frozen ground, using blunter edges that fractured soil instead of slicing it. Tool adaptation mattered. Improvisation mattered. The people who survived longest weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones who adjusted fastest. You're keenly aware now that everything you do underground happens under a clock you can't see. Oxygen, structural integrity, moisture. None of these problems announce themselves loudly at first. They whisper. A subtle change in smell, a faint creak, a damp patch that wasn't there yesterday. Ignoring whispers out here is how people disappear. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how many deaths in sod houses and dugouts were caused by collapse versus suffocation. Records are vague, often reduced to a single line in a ledger. Perished in storm. But among settlers, the dangers were well known. Roofs were reinforced obsessively. Ventilation was sacred. You follow those unspoken rules religiously now. As winter grinds on, your body changes in small ways. You lose weight, but you gain efficiency. Movements are economical. You waste nothing: energy, food, motion. Hunger sharpens focus rather than panicking you. Cold no longer feels like an enemy so much as a boundary line you know how to stay behind. Psychologically, the underground world continues to reshape you. You find your thoughts slowing, deepening. Long silences no longer feel empty. They feel full of listening, of awareness. Modern scholars might argue that this kind of enforced stillness altered cognitive patterns, encouraging introspection or even dissociation. You don't have the language for that. You just know that loud thinking no longer helps. You also notice something else. Fear has become specific. Early on, everything scared you. The wind, the snow, the night. Now fear has boundaries. You're afraid of blocked ventilation, of sudden thaws that destabilize ceilings, of underestimating cold after sunset. This specificity makes fear useful instead of paralyzing. Stories circulate when you occasionally encounter others. Brief meetings, shouted conversations across snowbanks. People compare notes on how deep they dug, how thick their roofs are, how many storms they've endured underground. There's no boasting in these conversations, just information. Pride doesn't keep anyone warm. Some settlers argue passionately that living underground is temporary, a necessary evil until better materials arrive. Others quietly admit they prefer it. There's a debate even now, unspoken but present, about what progress really means. Is it rising higher above the land or learning how to fit into it without being crushed? You suspect the answer depends on whether you're alive to ask the question. One evening, a storm arrives faster than expected. The temperature drops hard, wind slams into the prairie with no build-up. You're underground before the worst of it hits, but the sudden pressure change rattles loose soil from the ceiling. Fine dirt sprinkles down, dusting your shoulders like ash. Your heart jumps, but the structure holds. You reinforce the weak spot carefully, slowly, talking yourself through the steps. Panic would waste oxygen. Precision saves it. This moment, calm under threat, is the clearest sign yet that you've changed. There's a fringe theory among some historians that frontier survival required a kind of emotional flattening, a narrowing of responses to conserve mental energy. Living underground accelerates that process. Extreme highs and lows are liabilities here. Stability is everything. As the storm howls uselessly above, you sit back against the earth wall and let yourself feel tired. Not defeated, just spent. There's comfort in that, the kind that comes from having done exactly what needed doing and nothing more. You think back to the day you first arrived on the plains, standing upright under an enormous sky, imagining a future built outward and upward. You smile faintly at the memory. That version of you didn't understand the land yet, didn't know where safety actually lived. Now you do. Safety isn't visible from a distance. It doesn't announce itself with walls or chimneys or fences. It's quiet, low, buried. It's found by people willing to adapt their expectations as deeply as they dig into the soil. As the storm continues to expend its fury overhead, you rest underground, breathing evenly, listening to the muted roar filtered through layers of earth. The plains can throw whatever they want at the surface tonight. You're not there. You're below, where the wind loses its teeth, where the cold slows down and where survival stops being a gamble and becomes finally a practice skill. Living underground teaches you a new relationship with darkness. At first, it felt oppressive, like something pressing in on your thoughts. Now it feels more like a blanket. Heavy, yes, but insulating. Darkness stops demanding things from you. It doesn't ask you to see farther, go faster, or stay alert in the wrong ways. It encourages stillness, and stillness, you've learned, conserves heat, strength, and sanity. Light becomes precious and intentional. You don't waste it. A small lamp or candle isn't something you leave burning out of habit. It's something you use when needed, then extinguish carefully. Shadows stretch along dirt walls, soft-edged and unmoving. You begin to navigate by touch and memory more than sight. In a strange way, this makes the space feel larger, not smaller. Your mind fills in what your eyes no longer demand. There's a historical fact buried in winter diaries from the plains that often surprises modern readers. Many settlers deliberately limited artificial light during long storms to preserve fuel and reduce oxygen consumption. Darkness wasn't just tolerated, it was managed. People slept more, spoke less, and moved minimally. Underground living made this easier, because the environment already encouraged restraint. You notice how sound behaves in the dark. Without light, every noise seems closer, more intimate. The soft scrape of soil settling, the faint hiss of a flame, the slow rhythm of your own breathing. These sounds become your indicators that everything is functioning as it should. Silence isn't absence, it's information. Smoke management becomes one of your constant concerns. Even a small fire produces fumes that linger underground. You adjust airflow obsessively, learning how much heat you can generate before the air turns heavy. Too little fire and cold creeps back in. Too much and your head aches, your thoughts dull. Carbon monoxide wasn't a known term yet, but its effects were understood through bitter experience. There's a quirky but grim detail from frontier records. Canaries and other small birds were sometimes kept in underground or enclosed spaces because their distress signaled bad air faster than humans noticed it. Long before mines used the practice formally, settlers understood the principle. Life underground sharpened awareness of invisible dangers. You manage your fire carefully now, keeping it low and steady. The goal isn't comfort, it's equilibrium. Underground living teaches you that extremes are always the enemy. Too hot, too cold, too bright, too loud. Balance keeps you alive. Psychologically, this balance does something subtle. Your emotions flatten, but not in a hollow way. Instead, they smooth out, losing sharp edges. Panic becomes less frequent. Joy becomes quieter. Everything feels muted, like sound filtered through soil. Some scholars argue this emotional levelling was protective, preventing mental collapse during prolonged isolation. Others suggest it led to long-term numbness. You can't evaluate that yet. You're still inside it. You think often about people above ground during storms, those who didn't or couldn't dig, how the noise must have been unbearable, how the wind would have forced itself into every thought, every corner of their shelter. Underground, sound is absorbed. The storm is reduced to a distant presence like thunder heard miles away. That distance is psychological as much as physical. As another multi-day storm settles in, you fall into a pattern that feels almost natural. Wake, check air, eat something small, sit quietly, sleep again. Time stretches and folds in on itself. Days don't feel long or short, they feel thick, dense with waiting. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether this kind of waiting, this forced stillness, reshaped frontier culture in lasting ways. Some suggest it fostered patience and endurance. Others argue it delayed development, encouraging isolation over community building. But those arguments assume choice. Out here, winter doesn't offer many. You pass time by running your hands over the walls, feeling for changes. A damp patch, a crack, a bulge that wasn't there before. The earth communicates slowly but clearly if you pay attention. You respond in kind, adjusting before problems grow large enough to matter. One night you wake suddenly, heart racing, certain something is wrong. The space feels different. Not colder, not louder, just wrong. You sit up, breathing carefully, and realise the ventilation cloth has gone still. No flutter, no movement. You move immediately, but without panic. Panic wastes air. You clear the shaft methodically, pushing upward until snow breaks free and cold air rushes down. The cloth flutters again. The space exhales with you. Crisis averted. That moment stays with you. Not as fear, but as confirmation. Underground survival isn't forgiving, but it is predictable. Problems announce themselves softly before they become fatal. The trick is being quiet enough to hear them. There's a fringe belief recorded in some frontier letters that people who survived multiple winters underground became weather-wise in a way others never did. Not mystical, practical. They noticed shifts others ignored. They trusted small signals over dramatic ones. You recognise that in yourself now. When the storm finally breaks, you don't rush to celebrate. You wait an extra day, let drifts settle. Let temperatures reveal their true direction. You've seen too many false endings. The ground teaches patience by rewarding it consistently. When you do emerge, the world feels louder than you remember. Wind whistles faintly. Snow crunches aggressively underfoot. Light feels harsh. You squint, disoriented, like someone surfacing from deep water. It takes time to adjust. You take stock carefully. Nothing major damaged. The surface reshaped again, but manageable. You do what needs doing, then retreat once more underground before nightfall. Exposure after sunset is still a risk you refuse to take lightly. As you settle back into the earth, you reflect on how thoroughly your definition of comfort has changed. Comfort isn't softness anymore. It isn't space or brightness or warmth in excess. Comfort is predictability, control, the absence of sudden danger. Underground, those conditions exist more often than anywhere else on the plains in winter. You rest your back against the dirt wall, listening to the muffled quiet. Somewhere above, the prairie stretches endlessly, beautiful and lethal in equal measure. Down here, it loses its reach. Down here, you are not brave or bold or defiant. You are simply prepared. And in a land that punishes every mistake, preparation is the closest thing to peace you're ever going to find. By the time the next storm arrives, you barely register it as an event. It's more like background noise to a life already shaped around endurance. The wind rises, snow follows, and you adjust without ceremony. Food is portioned, ventilation is checked, fire is kept low. The storm does what storms do, you do what you've learned to do. This isn't courage anymore, it's routine. What makes this stretch of winter different is duration. Not intensity, not drama. Length. The storm doesn't hit hard and leave, it settles in. Days pass without meaningful change. The sound above becomes constant, a steady pressure rather than an assault. This is the kind of weather that wears people down quietly, not through fear, but through monotony. Historically, these multi-day storms were among the most dangerous, not because they killed quickly, but because they tested systems. Fuel ran low, food dwindled, small mistakes compounded, Frontier records describe blizzards lasting 3, 4, even 5 days, during which entire regions became unreachable. No help came. Whatever you had underground was all you were going to get. You feel that reality settle in now. Supplies don't feel scarce yet, but you're aware of their limits. Every decision carries weight. Do you burn fuel for warmth or save it for cooking? Do you eat now or stretch rations thinner? Underground living buys you time, but time still has a cost. You notice how your thoughts begin looping more during these long stretches. The same memories resurface, the same worries circle back. Isolation doesn't invent fears, it amplifies the ones already there. You counter this by imposing structure. You set small goals, clean one corner, reinforce one wall, melt exactly enough snow for the day. There's a scholarly debate about whether pioneers were more psychologically resilient than modern people or simply lacked alternatives. Some historians argue that frontier hardship fostered extraordinary mental toughness. Others suggest people endured because they had no choice, and that many paid for it later in silence. Diaries hint at both, often from the same hand. You understand now why underground shelters were sometimes called storm holes. Not because they were crude, but because they were places you retreated into while the world above lost coherence. They weren't meant to be comfortable. They were meant to function when nothing else could. Here's a grim but real detail. During prolonged storms, some settlers avoided moving at all for hours at a time, believing stillness conserved oxygen and heat. In underground spaces with limited ventilation, that instinct was sometimes correct. Motion wasn't freedom, it was risk. You practice that stillness now. You sit wrapped in layers, listening. Your body becomes an anchor point, conserving energy. Hunger sharpens your senses instead of dulling them. You feel small changes in air pressure. You notice when the fire burns slightly differently. These are your indicators that the system is still balanced. The storm outside continues without variation. Snow piles higher, drifts compact. The prairie disappears completely, reduced to sound and pressure. You have no idea what the surface looks like anymore, and you don't need to. Underground, visual information matters less than internal consistency. You think about children who grew up like this. It's hard not to. Historical accounts mention kids learning to walk in dugouts, learning not to stand up too fast, learning to play quietly during storms. For them, underground life wasn't adaptation, it was normal. Scholars still debate the long-term effects of that upbringing. Some argue it produced remarkable resilience, others point to delayed social development. Again, the records don't give clean answers. You manage your sleep carefully during this stretch. Long storms disrupt natural rhythms. Without daylight cues, your body drifts. You counter that by enforcing rest periods even when you're not tired. Fatigue leads to mistakes, and mistakes underground compound fast. At one point, late in the storm, the air feels heavier than usual. Not dangerous yet, but different. You don't ignore it. You clear the ventilation shaft more thoroughly, pushing until your arms ache. Fresh air rushes in, sharp and cold. You breathe deeply. Then seal the opening just enough to restore balance. That decision matters. People died ignoring that feeling. Suffocation doesn't come dramatically. It arrives quietly, disguised as drowsiness. Underground living rewards attentiveness. It punishes assumption. There's a fringe belief recorded in some communities that storms had phases. The most dangerous moment wasn't the beginning or the peak, but the lull in the middle when people relax too soon. While not scientific, the idea holds practical truth. Complacency kills faster than fear. When the storm finally begins to loosen its grip, you don't notice right away. The change is subtle. The sound above shifts pitch. Pressure eases slightly. Snow still falls, but the wind loses its edge. You wait. You always wait. Eventually you emerge into a world buried deeper than any you've seen yet. Drifts tower overhead, smooth and silent. Everything is muffled. Even your own movements feel intrusive. You carve narrow paths carefully, because open space invites wind to reclaim its strength. This is where underground living proves its final advantage during long storms. Recovery. You're not exhausted. You're not hypothermic. You're not desperate. You're tired, yes, but functional. You can dig, you can repair, you can think. You work methodically, uncovering entrances, checking structures, restoring access routes. Each task feels heavy but manageable. That's the difference time underground makes. It preserves capacity. As night approaches, you retreat again, not because the storm demands it, but because winter still does. The temperature drops quickly after sunset, and you've learned not to argue with that. Underground, the air stays steady. The silence returns. You sit quietly, feeling the aftershock of endurance rather than the adrenaline of survival. That's a new sensation. Surviving no longer feels like a victory. It feels like maintenance, and that's a good thing. The planes will throw more storms at you. You know that now. They don't stop just because you've adapted. But each time the ground gives you the same answer. Come down, slow down, wait. And as you settle back into the familiar darkness, wrapped in earth and patience, you understand why so many pioneers learned to trust the underground more than the sky. Because up there, everything changes without warning. Down here, change happens slowly enough to survive. By now, the underground world has rewritten your sense of what normal looks like. You no longer measure life by what's visible. Instead, you measure it by what holds steady. Air that stays breathable. Walls that don't shift unexpectedly. A ceiling that doesn't shed soil when the wind changes direction. These are your markers of success. Everything else is decoration. You think about how strange this would sound to someone back east. Someone used to measuring progress by bigger houses, taller buildings, more light. Out here, progress is quieter. It's the absence of crisis. It's the knowledge that when the prairie decides to test you again, you already know where you'll be. This is the winter where children raised on the plains truly come into focus for you. You've heard the stories, of course. Kids learning early not to stand upright too fast in dugouts. Kids knowing how to clear ventilation holes before they can read. Historical accounts confirm it. Children in sod houses and dugouts often took on practical survival roles shockingly young by modern standards. They weren't coddled by circumstance. They were shaped by it. You imagine what it must have been like for them. This half-buried world as the baseline of reality. Darkness and earth smells as normal. Wind as something distant and abstract, heard but rarely faced directly. Scholars still debate whether this upbringing created exceptional resilience or quietly traumatic conditioning. Diaries from adults who grew up this way sometimes speak fondly of the closeness and warmth, and sometimes hint at lifelong restlessness once they left. Underground life compresses people together, physically and emotionally. There's no space to escape one another's moods. Every sigh, every shift, every whispered word carries weight. In families, this closeness either forged deep bonds or exposed every fault line. You alone feel a different version of it. There's no one else to blame for tension. No one else to distract you from your own thoughts. You've learned to manage that by keeping your mind occupied, but gently. You don't force productivity. You let tasks arise naturally. Check the walls, repack insulation, adjust storage. These small acts keep you oriented. They remind you that you still have agency, even if the larger world feels locked down by winter. There's a curious, almost tender frontier detail that surfaces in a few letters from this period. Parents marking children's growth on dirt walls, the same way others marked height on doorframes. In underground homes, the wall was the constant. It made sense. The earth held memories the way wood once had. You catch yourself running your fingers over the walls again, feeling their texture change with moisture and temperature. The soil tells you stories if you pay attention. It tells you when thaw is near, when another freeze is coming, when the roof needs attention. You trust it more than the sky now. There's an ongoing debate among environmental historians about whether sod and dugout living represented a uniquely American adaptation or a continuation of much older human traditions. Earth-sheltered dwellings existed across Europe and Asia for thousands of years. The plains didn't inspire innovation so much as memory. Humans rediscovering what worked before industrial convenience made them forget. Winter begins to show subtle signs of fatigue. Not surrender, just wear. The sun climbs a fraction higher. Shadows behave differently. Thaws last a little longer before freezing hard again. These changes are incremental, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Underground, you notice them sooner than most. The walls feel softer longer each day. This is a dangerous phase. Thaw weakens structures, melting snow saturates soil, roofs grow heavier before they lighten. Many dugouts collapse not in the heart of winter, but during its transition. You reinforce carefully, even though part of you wants to relax. Experience tells you this isn't the time for that. Here's a grim but documented reality. Some settlers survived the coldest storms only to die during spring thaws when ceilings failed. The ground giveth, and the ground taketh away. Underground living is safer, but never safe. You adjust drainage channels, deepen shallow trenches to guide water away. You widen the entrance slightly to reduce moisture buildup. Each modification feels like insurance against complacency. The storm season may be easing, but the danger hasn't left yet. Psychologically, this phase messes with people. Hope creeps in too early, plans resurface prematurely. Scholars note a spike in accidents and deaths during late winter and early spring attributed to impatience and overconfidence. You fight that impulse deliberately. You remind yourself how quickly conditions can reverse. You still hear stories of people venturing too far on nice days, only to be caught by sudden cold snaps. Of cabins collapsing under melt-heavy snow. Of illness spreading as dampness increases. The threats change shape, but they don't disappear. Underground, the shift is gentler. The earth releases heat slowly. It absorbs meltwater reluctantly. You work with that rhythm instead of against it. When the air feels heavy, you vent more. When walls soften, you brace. This dance, this constant adjustment, has become second nature. One afternoon you realise something quietly astonishing. You're no longer counting days until winter ends. You're counting how well your system is holding. That's a profound shift. It means winter no longer owns your attention completely. You're thinking beyond it, not in defiance, but in continuity. You think about what you'll build when the ground fully thaws, whether you'll return to an above-ground home or expand what you already have. Many settlers faced this choice. Some abandoned dugouts gratefully. Others incorporated them permanently. Root cellars, storm shelters, cool storage. Underground space, once learned, was rarely forgotten. There's debate among historians about how many people willingly returned underground even after better materials became available. Hard numbers are scarce, but the cultural memory lingered. Storm cellars, tornado shelters, basements, these are descendants of lessons learned the hard way on the plains. As evening falls, you sit underground, listening to the softened sounds above. The wind still moves, but it lacks its old authority. The earth feels damp, but seepable and stable. You're alert without being tense. That balance took months to learn. You realise now that underground living didn't just protect your body, it reshaped your expectations. You no longer assume the world owes you comfort or clarity. You assume variability and plan for it. That mindset is the real shelter you've built. When you finally lie down to rest, you feel something close to gratitude. Not relief, gratitude. The ground taught you something the open sky never could, that survival isn't about standing tall in every moment. Sometimes it's about knowing when to lower yourself into the safest layer of the world and wait. And as the prairie above prepares, slowly, reluctantly, to release winter's grip, you remain underground. Not trapped, not hiding, but steady, patient, and very much alive. Even after everything you've endured, there are storms that stand apart. Events so severe they become reference points, spoken about in hushed tones long after the snow melts. One of those is the Great Plains Blizzards of 1888, a storm that rewrote survival rules and permanently altered how people understood winter out here. You weren't there, not exactly, but its shadow stretches into every decision you make underground. You've heard the stories, everyone has. How the day began almost politely, how the air felt crisp but manageable. Children went to school, adults tended chores. Nothing about the morning warned of what was coming. That's the detail people fixate on, the betrayal of it. Because by afternoon, the temperature plummeted with terrifying speed, and wind arrived like a wall. Historically, the Great Blizzard of 1888 killed hundreds across the northern plains, many of them caught in the open. School teachers froze alongside their students. Farmers died within sight of their homes. The storm didn't just snow, it erased visibility, dropped temperatures more than 40 degrees in hours, and turned familiar ground into a killing field. It became a lesson written in lives. You think about that storm often now, because it explains something crucial. Most winter deaths didn't happen during long, obvious blizzards. They happened during sudden ones, during moments when people trusted the surface too much. Underground living wasn't just about endurance, it was about unpredictability. That's why the blizzard of 88 mattered so much. It shattered the idea that you'd always get warning. It taught survivors that shelter had to be immediate, not aspirational. That you couldn't rely on cabins across fields or towns a mile away. You needed protection where you stood, or below you. You imagine what it would have felt like to be above ground that day. The way the wind would steal breath instantly. How the cold would lock muscles without ceremony. People didn't collapse dramatically. They slowed, then stopped. Exposure worked faster than panic could. That's where underground shelter becomes more than preference. It becomes survival math. Down below, temperature doesn't drop in minutes, wind doesn't exist, visibility doesn't matter. The storm loses its advantage entirely. There's a haunting lesser-known detail from that blizzard. Many victims were found curled into fences, buildings, or shallow depressions in the land. Instinct drove them low, toward anything that broke the wind or hinted at shelter. It wasn't enough, but the instinct was right. A few feet deeper and some of them might have lived. You think about that when you sit underground now, the ceiling just inches above your head. This isn't comfort. It's proximity to safety. It's the difference between reacting too late and being exactly where you need to be when the world turns hostile. Scholars still debate how directly the blizzard of '88 influenced the rise of underground and earth-sheltered structures across the plains. Some argue the trend was already underway. Others point to a noticeable spike in dugouts, storm cellars, and partially buried homes in the years that followed. Trauma changes architecture. Memory reshapes design. You feel that lineage in your own choices. You don't wait for storms to declare themselves. You don't assume you'll have time to respond. Underground readiness is built in. That's the lesson people paid for with their lives in 1888. The storm also changed how communities thought about distance. Before, a mile didn't feel far. Afterward, it felt fatal. Underground shelter eliminated distance entirely. It put safety directly beneath your feet, not somewhere you hope to reach. There's a grim, almost ironic fact connected to that winter. Many of the people who died were experienced, not naive. They'd survived previous winters. They trusted their judgment. The storm didn't care. That realization echoes through frontier culture afterward. Experience helps, but only if paired with humility. You absorb that lesson deeply. You don't assume that surviving previous storms guarantees future safety. Every event resets the rules. Underground living respects that reality by reducing variables instead of trying to master them. You imagine what a dugout would have meant during the blizzard of '88. How the temperature drop would have been buffered. How the wind would have been reduced to sound alone. How people could have waited instead of wandering. It doesn't make the tragedy easier to accept, but it clarifies the logic behind what you're doing now. The storm became folklore quickly, passed along as warning rather than spectacle. Parents told children about it. Settlers mentioned it casually, the way people reference disasters they barely survived. Like in '88, they'd say, and everyone understood. That shared memory hardened attitudes toward winter. It made people suspicious of mild mornings and clear skies. It made underground shelters seem less extreme and more responsible. After that, digging wasn't defeat. It was intelligence. You feel that shift even now, decades later, in the cultural residue of the plains. Storm cellars, root cellars, basements, all of them descendants of one brutal realization. The safest place during sudden weather isn't ahead of you, it's below you. As you sit underground during a smaller, quieter storm, you imagine the prairie above during 1888. Chaos, confusion, loss. Then you compare it to your current reality. Muted sound, stable air. Time stretched gently instead of stolen violently. The contrast is stark. You don't romanticize underground living because of that. You respect it. You treat it like equipment, not ideology. It's a tool forged by catastrophe and refined by repetition. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether the blizzard of '88 fundamentally changed American attitudes toward nature, shifting from conquest to accommodation. Some argue the myth of dominance persisted. Others see a subtle turn toward preparation and restraint, especially in how people built and settled. Underground architecture sits right at the center of that argument. From your perspective, the debate feels abstract. What matters is this. Storms like that don't announce themselves politely. They don't negotiate. They don't care how brave you feel. Underground, bravery isn't required, only presence. As night deepens and wind whispers above, you sit with the weight of that history pressing lightly on the soil overhead. People died so these lessons could be learned. People survived long enough to pass them on. You are part of that chain now, whether you intended to be or not. The Great Plain Blizzard of 1888 doesn't feel distant to you. It feels instructional. A reminder etched into the land itself, carried forward in dirt walls and low ceilings, and the instinct to go down instead of out. You shift slightly, settle back into the earth, and listen to the storm waste its energy against a surface you no longer depend on. Above ground, winter still holds power. Down here it has already lost. There's a particular fear that only comes from being buried, not metaphorically, but literally. You don't feel it all the time. Most days, underground feels secure, even sensible. But when the snow pile's high enough, when the storms stack one on top of another without pause, that fear creeps in quietly. The fear isn't of cold anymore, it's of weight. You notice it when the ceiling sounds different, not louder, deeper. The earth doesn't creak the way wood does. It compresses, it settles. Snow above turns dense, heavy, almost stone-like as it's driven by wind and then locked in place by cold. Each new layer adds pressure. You feel it not on your body, but in your awareness. There are historical accounts, grim, factual ones, of entire sod houses disappearing beneath snowdrifts. Rooflines vanished. Doors became walls. Chimneys were the only signs that anything human existed below. In some cases, people survived for days like that, tunneling upward carefully. In others, they didn't. Being buried alive wasn't dramatic, it was suffocatingly quiet. You've already taken precautions against this, but awareness sharpens during stretches like this. You check the ceiling more often. You brace where the earth feels softer. You listen for settling that's uneven. Snow doesn't just sit on roofs, it migrates, pushed by wind into drifts that concentrate weight in dangerous ways. There's a strange, unsettling frontier detail that circulates in stories. Some people reportedly tunneled out through stovepipes when doors and entrances vanished. Whether every account is true is debated, but the fact that people planned for that possibility tells you everything you need to know. Being underground wasn't the end of risk. It just changed its shape. This is where design matters most. Dugouts with flat ceilings fared worse under heavy snow. Slight arches distributed weight better. Roofs reinforced with layers of sod and grass roots held together longer. These weren't aesthetic choices, they were structural lessons paid for in collapse and survival. You've shaped your ceiling accordingly, not perfectly arched, but angled just enough to encourage weight to spread. You've left yourself multiple exit options, not easy ones, but possible ones. That knowledge steadies you when the storm refuses to let up. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how often people actually survive full burial versus how often those stories became exaggerated folklore. Hard numbers are scarce. What's clear is that the fear of burial shaped behaviour profoundly. It encouraged redundant ventilation, multiple exits, and constant monitoring. Fear, when focused, became another survival tool. As the storm continues, snow presses down harder. The entrance is completely sealed now. You know it is because no light leaks through the edges anymore. You don't try to open it. That would waste energy and expose you to collapse. Instead, you rely on airflow and patience. Underground, patience is not passive. It's active restraint. You stay alert without moving unnecessarily. You test the ceiling gently, listening for shifts. You clear the ventilation shaft with careful, measured pushes. Fresh air still comes. That's what matters. And then you think about how terrifying this must have been for first-time settlers. People who dug shallow shelters without understanding snow behaviour. People who didn't know that snow could become heavier than earth when compacted by wind. Knowledge here isn't academic, it's structural. There's a documented fact from prairie settlements that during particularly heavy winters, some communities marked underground homes with tall poles or flags to indicate where people were buried beneath drifts. Above ground, the town looked empty. Below, life continued. That image sticks with you. Human presence reduced to markers protruding from snow. Psychologically, this is one of the hardest tests. Being underground during a storm is one thing. Being underground knowing the surface has erased you entirely is another. It forces a confrontation with vulnerability that's hard to soften. You manage it the same way you manage everything else now, by narrowing focus. Air, structure, time. You don't imagine collapse unless there's evidence. You don't imagine rescue unless it's possible. You stay exactly where you are, in the safest layer you know. The storm doesn't end quickly. Snow keeps arriving, driven into place relentlessly. You feel the pressure increase, then stabilize. That's the earth doing its job, redistributing weight. You trust it because you've built with that in mind. Here's a fringe belief from the plains that you've heard more than once, that snow is kinder than ice. Snow can insulate. Ice crushes. There's truth in that. The weight above you is heavy, but it's not so solid. It still breathes, hurt you. Eventually, slowly, without announcement, the pressure stops increasing. The storm has reached its limit. Snow no longer piles higher, it only shifts. That's your first sign that the worst has passed. You don't celebrate, you don't rush, you wait for settling, for melt, for the ground to decide what it's going to do next. Being buried isn't a moment, it's a process. When you finally begin clearing the entrance, it's with care bordering on reverence. One wrong movement could bring the ceiling down. You carve a narrow passage, reinforcing as you go. Light returns gradually, diffused through packed snow before breaking open into grey daylight. When you emerge, the world feels unreal. Drifts tower overhead. Familiar landmarks are gone. You're standing where nothing appears to have existed before. Only your careful excavation proves otherwise. You look back at the entrance, low, unassuming, nearly invisible from a distance, and feel a deep, complicated gratitude. Underground living didn't just shield you from cold and wind, it protected you from disappearance. You step out briefly, check the damage, then retreat again before nightfall. Snow burial isn't a victory you want to tempt twice in one day. As you settle back below, muscles aching, lungs full, you reflect on how close survival can come to invisibility. How easily people above ground might pass over this place without knowing life endured beneath their feet. Out here, that's the truth of winter. It doesn't just test strength, it erases presence. Underground, you learn how to exist without being seen, and how sometimes that's exactly what keeps you alive. After being buried, even briefly, you never think about air the same way again. It stops being invisible. It becomes a resource, measurable, precious, finite. Every breath carries weight now, not because you're panicking, but because you're aware of how easily it can be disrupted underground. Ventilation becomes your quiet obsession. You check it more often than food, you listen to it, you feel for it. The soft movement of air is as reassuring as a heartbeat. When it falters, even slightly, your body reacts before your mind catches up. Historically, suffocation was one of the most feared underground deaths on the plains. It didn't leave dramatic evidence, it didn't scar the land, it simply ended lives in places that otherwise looked intact. There are documented cases of families surviving storms only to be found later with no signs of struggle, victims of blocked vents or poor airflow. That knowledge informs everything you do now. Your ventilation shaft isn't an afterthought, it's a primary system. You keep it straight, short and easier to clear. You mark it carefully on the surface so drifting snow doesn't hide it completely. You've learnt that snow doesn't just fall, it creeps, seals and suffocates. There's a clever, almost elegant frontier trick you adopt. You hang a lightweight strip of cloth inside near the vent opening. As long as it moves, air is flowing. If it stills, you act immediately. No hesitation, this simple indicator has saved lives and you treat it with the respect it deserves. You also learn to read the air itself. When oxygen drops, the first sign isn't panic, it's dullness. Your thoughts slow, your limbs feel heavy, sleepiness creeps in, seductive and dangerous. Recognizing that early is critical. You've trained yourself to treat unexplained drowsiness as a warning, not a relief. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how pioneers conceptualized these invisible dangers without modern science. Some argue they relied on superstition. Others point out that repeated observation built a functional, experience-based understanding of air quality. You don't need chemistry to know when something feels wrong. You need attention. During one long storm, your ventilation shaft ices over repeatedly. You clear it every few hours, sometimes more. It's tedious, exhausting work, especially when the air above is razor cold. But you've learned that effort spent on airflow pays the highest return. Heat can be endured, hunger can be managed, bad air cannot. You adapt further, widening the upper portion of the shaft slightly, so snow sheds instead of packing tightly. You add a crude hood above it using scavenged boards, angled to deflect wind-driven snow. None of this is elegant. All of it works. There's a quirky historical note buried in settler correspondence. Some people used hollowed-out logs or bundled reeds as ventilation chimneys, discovering that rough interior surfaces reduced ice build-up compared to smooth pipes. Trial and error taught them what engineering textbooks would later explain. Underground living forces you to think in systems. Fire affects air affects sleep affects judgment affects survival. Everything connects. You stop making isolated decisions, you think in chains of consequence. Psychologically, this awareness sharpens you. You're not anxious, you're attentive. There's a difference. Anxiety imagines threats. Attention monitors reality. Underground life rewards the latter ruthlessly. One night during a storm that refuses to end, you wake with a mild headache. It's faint, easy to dismiss. You don't. You check the vent. It's partially blocked, crusted with ice. You clear it fully, then wait, breathing slowly until the pressure in your head eases. Crisis avoided, quietly. You think about how many people didn't recognize that signal in time. How many mistook drowsiness for exhaustion. How many lay down intending to rest and never woke. It's a sobering thought, but it reinforces discipline rather than fear. There's a fringe belief recorded in some frontier communities that underground air felt older or heavier, almost alive. While poetic, there's truth there. Air in enclosed spaces behaves differently. It lingers. It carries moisture, smoke, breath. You respect it because you feel it, not because you fear it. As winter drags on, ventilation becomes as automatic as breathing itself. Check vent, feel air, adjust fire, repeat. These rituals ground you. They give structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into waiting. When storms finally ease, you're cautious about opening up too much too fast. Fresh air is good, but sudden temperature changes can destabilize ceilings. You vent gradually, letting the underground space adjust at its own pace. You've learned not to shock systems unnecessarily. Above ground, people might see this attention to airflow as paranoia. Underground, it's competence. It's the difference between survival and tragedy. You sit quietly one evening, cloth near the vent fluttering gently, fire low and steady. The space feels balanced. Not warm, not cold, just right. That equilibrium is hard won. It represents dozens of small decisions made correctly over time. You realise then that underground living isn't just about hiding from storms, it's about managing what you bring with you, heat, smoke, breath, and making sure none of it turns against you. It's about understanding that survival isn't passive, it's active maintenance of balance. As wind murmurs above, unable to reach you, you breathe evenly and listen to the soft, reassuring movement of air. The storm can press and pile and scream all at once. Down here, you're still breathing. And that, in the end, is the quiet victory underground living offers. One careful breath at a time. At some point during winter, the line between human space and animal space blurs completely. It's not philosophical, it's practical. When temperatures plunge low enough and wind strips heat from anything exposed, warm bodies become resources, and sometimes those bodies have hooves. You'd heard the stories before winter ever arrived. About people bringing animals inside, about calves sleeping near stoves, about chickens roosting in corners of dugouts. At first it sounded desperate, even a little absurd. Now it just sounds efficient. Livestock don't survive prairie winters on stubbornness. They survive by shelter and proximity. Out in the open, even the strongest animals weaken quickly. Wind breaks them down faster than hunger ever could. Underground, or partially underground, space changes that equation. Historically, frontier records show that during severe winters, many settlers prioritized animal shelter even over personal comfort. Losing livestock often meant losing everything: food, income, labor, future planting. A family might survive a winter physically, but be ruined financially if animals didn't make it through. Underground shelter became a shared lifeline. You start small, one animal at a time during the worst nights. The logistics are awkward. The smell is immediate and unmistakable. There's noise, movement, heat, and chaos where there used to be quiet order. But the temperature changes noticeably. The air feels less brittle. The cold backs off just a little. That little bit matters. Here's a documented but rarely discussed fact. A single cow can produce as much body heat as a small stove when enclosed. Pioneers didn't calculate this scientifically, but they felt it instantly. Animals weren't just passengers underground, they were heaters. You're careful though. Animals consume oxygen too. Ventilation becomes even more critical. You adjust airflow constantly, finding the balance between warmth and breathable air. It's another system layered onto the ones you're already managing. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how common this practice truly was. Some historians argue that animal sheltering underground was rare and limited to extreme emergencies. Others point to multiple first-hand accounts suggesting it was far more widespread than official records imply. Like many frontier realities, it likely varied by region, severity, and desperation. What's undeniable is that the practice worked often enough to be remembered. You also notice how animals behave underground. They're calmer, quieter. They instinctively lower their heads, tuck in, conserve energy. In a strange way, they model the exact behaviour you've been learning yourself. Stillness, efficiency, patience. There's a peculiar intimacy that comes from sharing space like this. You're no longer pretending there's a hard boundary between human life and animal life. You're just two warm, breathing organisms waiting out the same storm in the same hole in the ground. Psychologically, that changes something. Isolation feels less absolute. You're reminded that survival here has always been communal. Even when the community includes hooves and fur, you hear stories of families sleeping in shifts to monitor animals, vent airflow, and maintain fire balance. Of children assigned to check vents because they were smaller and quicker. Of nights spent listening not to the wind, but to breathing, human and animal alike. There's a fringe belief recorded in some settler diaries that animals could sense bad air or approaching storms before people did. While there's no mystical explanation, animals are often more sensitive to pressure changes and oxygen levels. People learn to watch them closely. Restlessness could mean danger. Calm meant balance. You adopt that awareness naturally. When animals settle, you relax slightly. When they shift too often, you check systems. Underground living teaches you to observe everything, because everything communicates something. Of course, there are limits. Space is tight. Sanitation becomes a concern. Moisture increases. You don't keep animals underground longer than necessary. This isn't comfort, it's triage. When storms ease, animals go back out, into shelters dug deeper into drifts or banked with snow. There's an interesting historical detail tied to this practice. Some settlers deliberately built dugouts with low side chambers, specifically for animals, separate but connected to human space. These weren't barns in the traditional sense. They were heat-sharing systems, primitive, effective, and born entirely of necessity. You think about how modern survival advice often emphasizes self-reliance as isolation. One person, one plan, one kit. The frontier taught a different lesson. Survival here was layered and shared. Humans depended on animals. Animals depended on humans. The ground supported all of it. As winter stretches on, you find yourself less bothered by the presence of animals underground. The smells fade into the background. The sounds become familiar. In some ways, the space feels more alive with them there, less like a bunker and more like a living system. There's also something grounding about caring for another life during a storm. It pulls your attention outward, preventing the kind of mental spirals isolation can cause. You're not just waiting anymore. You're managing, responding, maintaining balance for more than yourself. Scholars debate whether this sense of responsibility buffered psychological stress during long winters. Some argue it gave people purpose beyond mere endurance. Others caution that the added burden increased exhaustion and risk. Both are probably true, depending on circumstance. For you, it's simple. Animals don't make winter easier. They make it survivable in a different way. When storms finally break and you guide animals back above ground, blinking in harsh light, there's a strange sense of transition. The underground space feels emptier, quieter, colder even. You're just systems again. Adapting back. You realise then that underground living was never static. It was always responsive, changing shape based on need. People, animals, weather, everything flowed in and out as conditions demanded. That flexibility is what made it work. As you sit alone underground again, fire low, vent clear, you reflect on how far you've come from that first frantic dig. Back then, underground meant hiding. Now, it means integration, with land, weather, and the living systems around you. The plains don't reward separation. They reward cooperation, sometimes in ways that feel humbling, even uncomfortable. You listen to the wind above, thinner now, less aggressive. Winter is still present, but it's loosening. Underground, you've learned how to absorb that pressure instead of resisting it. And sharing space with animals during the worst of it taught you something important. Survival here was never meant to be solitary. It was meant to be layered, shared and supported. By earth, by patience, and sometimes by a warm breathing presence beside you in the dark. There's a point in winter when the physical challenges stop being the hardest part. The cold still exists, the storms still come, but your body knows what to do now. It's your mind that starts testing you instead. Underground, with days blending together, and the outside world reduced to muffled sound and second-hand light, isolation becomes its own kind of weather. You notice it first in small ways. Your thoughts circle familiar paths more often. Old memories surface without invitation. Conversations replay themselves. sometimes word for word. Silence stretches longer between actions. None of this feels dangerous at first, it just feels heavy. This is the mental toll of buried living, and it was widely experienced even if it wasn't widely discussed. Historical journals from the plains occasionally hint at it, phrases like the days drag or the dark presses in. Rarely do people name despair outright, but it's there between the lines. Underground, stimulation is limited. There's no horizon to reset your thoughts, no changing scenery. The brain, designed to track movement and variation, turns inward when deprived. For some, that inward turn brought reflection and calm. For others, it brought restlessness and dread. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much this isolation contributed to what settlers called prairie madness or cabin fever. Some historians argue these conditions were exaggerated or misdiagnosed. Others believe long winters, isolation, and sensory deprivation genuinely strained mental health. The truth is likely both, and it depended heavily on individual temperament and circumstance. You manage it the only way anyone ever did out here: structure. You impose rhythm on days that would otherwise blur. You wake, check air, eat, tend fire, rest. You repeat. Routine becomes a psychological anchor, something solid to hold on to when time feels slippery. You also learn the value of intentional thought. Letting the mind wander freely underground can be risky. It spirals, it exaggerates, so you guide it gently, recounting memories in order, planning future tasks, imagining small improvements you'll make when conditions allow. You don't daydream wildly, you rehearse stability. Some settlers use storytelling to survive these stretches, recounting family histories aloud or repeating favourite tales. Others prayed constantly, not just for deliverance but for mental clarity. Still others sang quietly, even when alone. Sound, any sound, helped mark time and presence. You catch yourself talking out loud more often now. Not in full conversations, but comments, observations, reminders. It keeps your voice from feeling foreign when you eventually speak to another person. It keeps the sense of self intact. There's a curious historical note that surfaces in a few letters. People described feeling oddly startled by their own reflections after long periods underground. Faces looked unfamiliar in dim light. Expressions seemed exaggerated. It wasn't vanity, it was disorientation. When you don't see yourself often, your image stops feeling fixed. Underground living also warps your sense of scale. Small problems feel enormous. A blocked vent can dominate your entire mental landscape for hours. Conversely, massive storms feel distant, abstract, because you're insulated from their full sensory assault. The mind adapts to what it's fed. You're careful not to let fear inflate itself in this environment. You stick to evidence. Is the air moving? Is the structure stable? Is food sufficient? If the answers are yes, you don't entertain worst-case scenarios. Worry without action is a luxury winter doesn't afford. Isolation sharpens emotions you didn't expect. Gratitude becomes stronger. Small comforts, warmth in your hands, the steadiness of a wall, carry disproportionate weight. Frustration, when it appears, burns hotter but passes faster. Everything is compressed. There's a fringe belief recorded in some frontier communities that extended underground. Living changed people permanently, making them quieter, more inward, even after winter ended. While impossible to quantify, it's easy to see how months spent monitoring breath and balance would leave a mark. You don't emerge unchanged from a season like this. You think about families who endured this together, how the mental toll must have multiplied in confined space. Children restless, adults exhausted, no privacy, no escape. Scholars argue that this pressure either strengthened family bonds or fractured them beyond repair. Probably both, depending on how much strain already existed. Alone, your challenge is different. There's no conflict, but there's no distraction either. You're forced to confront yourself without noise. That can be unsettling. It can also be clarifying. You learn which thoughts are useful and which are not. You learn to let go of questions that have no answers yet. You learn that not every feeling requires action. Some just need acknowledgement before they pass. During particularly long underground stretches, you mark days physically, scratching small lines into wood or dirt, stacking pebbles, shifting objects. It's not about counting down to freedom. It's about confirming continuity. You were here yesterday, you're here today, you will likely be here tomorrow. There's a historical fact that stands out once you start noticing it. Many settlers who survived the harshest winters described spring not with joy, but with unease. After months underground, openness felt overwhelming. Noise felt intrusive, light felt harsh. Re-entry took time. You understand that now. Even brief trips above ground feel jarring. The sky seems too large, wind feels personal again. You find yourself eager to retreat, not out of fear, but out of familiarity. This raises an uncomfortable question scholars still debate. Did underground living merely preserve life? Or did it subtly reshape what people considered livable? Did survival gradually redefine comfort in ways that lingered long after danger passed? For you, the answer isn't abstract. You know this winter will stay with you. You'll carry its rhythms forward. You'll always listen more closely for air movement. You'll always mistrust sudden stunts. You'll always know how thin the line is between stability and collapse. One evening, during a rare lull, you feel a pang of longing for conversation, for laughter, for human presence. It hits hard, then fades. You don't fight it. You acknowledge it, then return to routine. Longing is information too. It reminds you what matters beyond survival. You think about how the underground life stripped existence down to essentials. Breath, heat, time, everything else became secondary. That narrowing, while difficult, also clarified priorities. Many settlers emerge from winters like this less patient with trivialities, less impressed by appearances. You sense that happening in yourself. The idea of complaining about discomfort feels absurd now. You've recalibrated what discomfort actually means. As winter slowly loosens its grip, the mental pressure eases too, but unevenly. Hope returns in flashes, then retreats. You don't trust it yet. You let it hover at the edges, cautious not to let it rush decisions. Underground, you've learnt that patience isn't passive endurance. It's active emotional regulation. It's knowing when to engage and when to wait. When you lie down to rest, the earth cool and familiar against your back, you feel both smaller and stronger than before. Smaller because you've accepted your limits. Stronger because you've learned how to live within them. The plains tested your body early. Underground, they tested your mind. And quietly, without ceremony, you adapted to that too. Not by conquering isolation, but by understanding it, pacing it, and letting it pass the same way you let storms pass overhead. One slow, steady day at a time. When the storms pin you underground long enough, stories begin to seep into the quiet. Not books or newspapers. Those are luxuries. But stories shaped by boredom, fear, and the need to make sense of waiting. This is where folklore takes root. Not around campfires, but in cramped earthen rooms where imagination has nothing else to chew on. You hear them second-hand, passed along during brief encounters, half-whispered as if the ground itself might be listening. Stories about sounds in the walls, about footsteps overhead during storms when no one should be out there, about voices carried down ventilation shafts that didn't belong to the wind. It's easy to dismiss these as exaggeration, but underground living creates perfect conditions for misinterpretation. Sound travels strangely through packed soil. Wind funnels itself through narrow gaps and comes back altered, warped into tones that don't quite resemble anything familiar. A branch scraping ice above can sound like deliberate movement. Settling earth can feel purposeful. There's a documented historical fact that during long winters, reports of strange noises and perceived presences increased across frontier settlements. Modern scholars attribute this to isolation, sensory deprivation, and heightened vigilance. But at the time, people didn't have those explanations. They had stories instead. You experience it yourself one night. The storm is light, barely worth noting, when you hear a dull, rhythmic thump above. Not loud, not urgent, just regular. Your heart rate jumps before reason catches up. You sit still, listening carefully. The sound continues, then stops. You don't panic. You've learned better than that. You wait. Eventually you realize it's snow slipping from a drift in measured intervals as the temperature shifts. Gravity, not intention. The explanation calms you, but the moment lingers longer than it should. This is how folklore begins, not with belief, but with uncertainty. People underground needed ways to talk about fear without admitting vulnerability. Stories did that work for them. They externalized anxiety, gave it shape. A noise became a wandering spirit. A pressure change became a warning. It was easier to say the ground is restless tonight than to say I'm scared and alone.
There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether frontier folklore intensified during winters, specifically because of underground living. Some historians argue the confinement amplified storytelling traditions. Others suggest folklore was simply more memorable during times of stress. Either way, winter dugouts became incubators for shared narratives. You hear about people who refused to sleep underground because they believed the earth could close in if angered. Others swore they felt safest there, convinced storms couldn't touch them once below a certain depth. Contradictions like these coexist easily when certainty is scarce. There's a quirky, unsettling frontier detail recorded in a few diaries. Some settlers named their dugouts, speaking to them as if they were living things. It sounds strange, but when your shelter is the reason you're alive, personification isn't far-fetched. Gratitude looks for expression. You catch yourself doing something similar, not naming the space, but acknowledging it. Running your hand along the wall before settling in. Checking the ceiling with care that feels almost respectful. You don't think the earth is alive, but you treat it as something that responds to attention. Folklore also filled time. Long nights underground stretched endlessly. Telling stories, even frightening ones, broke monotony. Fear shared is lighter than fear held alone. People repeated tales of storms, burials, near misses, each retelling smoothing some edges and sharpening others. You understand why many of these stories revolve around sound. Underground, sound is your primary sense. Sight is limited. Touch is constant but familiar. Sound carries novelty, and novelty draws focus. The mind, desperate for stimulation, assigns meaning. One night, during a particularly still stretch, you become acutely aware of your own breathing. It sounds too loud, too present. For a moment, it doesn't feel like it belongs to you. You recognize the sensation immediately. Not fear, but detachment. You ground yourself by touching the wall, feeling its cool solidity. This, too, shows up in historical accounts. People describing moments where they felt unreal, or as if the dugout were breathing with them. Modern psychology would call this dissociation. Frontier people called it winter strangeness, and moved on. You do the same. You don't dwell. You check systems. You focus on routine. Folklore thrives in idle minds. Work, however small, keeps it from taking hold. Still, some stories stick. Stories about buried towns where people lived an entire winter unseen. About chimneys poking from snow like grave markers. About travelers walking across drifts, unaware they were stepping over occupied homes. These stories blur the line between fact and imagination, but not entirely. Some of them happened. There's a documented case from the plains of a man walking across what he thought was a frozen field, only to hear voices beneath his feet. He hadn't known a family was buried below, their entrance sealed by snow. They survived. The story spread quickly, reshaped by retelling, but rooted in reality. That's the unsettling thing about underground folklore. It's never entirely fictional. It grows from real risks, real isolation, real survival. You think about how these stories functioned socially. They warned, they entertained, they explained the unexplainable. They gave people something to talk about when there was nothing to see. Psychologically, they also reinforced caution. A story about someone ignoring a strange sound and dying later encouraged vigilance. A tale about a dugout collapsing after neglect reminded people to reinforce roofs. Fear, shaped into narrative, became instruction. You start to notice how your own mind fills silence now. Not with fear exactly, but with heightened awareness. You hear every shift, every change in air movement, every subtle difference in sound texture. Underground living turns you into a listener first and a thinker second. That listening keeps you alive, but it also opens the door to imagination. You manage it by naming explanations immediately. You don't let ambiguity linger. Sound equals cause equals response. You refuse to let mystery grow roots. Even so, when wind finds a new path through the ventilation shaft and produces a low, almost vocal hum, it sends a shiver through you. You recognize the physics, you understand resonance, and still, your body reacts first. That reaction isn't weakness, it's calibration. Your nervous system is tuned to detect change quickly. Underground, that sensitivity is adaptive. As winter nears its end, folklore loses some of its grip. Light returns. Storms space out. The ground warms slightly. The mind relaxes. Stories feel less urgent, less necessary. But you know they'll return next winter, because conditions will recreate them. Isolation plus uncertainty equals narrative. Humans don't just endure environments, we explain them. You reflect on how these stories shaped frontier identity. They bonded communities. They passed lessons forward. They preserved memory in the absence of records. Underground living wasn't just physical adaptation, it was cultural. As you sit quietly, listening to the familiar hush of soil around you, you feel less disturbed by the idea of stories now. They're part of the ecosystem, another layer humans built to survive. The earth presses in, solid and unchanging. Wind murmurs uselessly above. Your breath moves steadily. Nothing supernatural is happening. But you understand, finally, why people told stories anyway. Because when you live beneath the surface long enough, imagination becomes another way of measuring what you can't see, and another tool for making it through the night. As winter drags toward its long, reluctant end, another question starts creeping into your thoughts, one that storms and survival pushed aside for months. What is this underground life doing to your health? Not just whether it keeps you alive, but what it's quietly changing while it does. You feel it in your lungs first. The air underground is heavier, always carrying traces of smoke, damp earth, and breath recycled many times over. Even with careful ventilation, it's not the same as open air. Your chest tightens some mornings. A shallow cough lingers longer than it should. It doesn't feel dangerous, but it feels noticeable. This concern wasn't unique to you. There's a real historical debate that runs through frontier letters, medical reports, and later scholarly work. Were sod houses and dugouts healthier than wooden cabins, or did they simply trade one set of dangers for another? On one side of the argument, doctors and officials at the time warned about dampness. Moist soil walls encouraged mold, condensation-soaked bedding. Respiratory illnesses, especially tuberculosis, were widespread on the frontier, and some blamed underground living for worsening them. From that perspective, sod homes weren't shelters. They were slow incubators. On the other side, survival records complicate that claim. People in sod houses suffered fewer cases of frostbite. Infants survived winters at higher rates when kept underground. Nighttime hypothermia, one of the most common killers in drafty cabins, was dramatically reduced. You can't ignore that trade-off. Living underground, you become acutely aware of hygiene in ways you never were above ground. There's no illusion of cleanliness here. Dirt is everywhere because the walls are dirt. You stop chasing purity and start chasing balance instead. You shake out bedding daily, even when it's cold. You keep sleeping areas elevated. You scrape moisture from walls. These small habits aren't about comfort. They're about preventing slow decline. Hygiene underground isn't about being clean. It's about being less wet. Here's a quirky but genuine frontier detail. Many settlers used whitewash, lime mixed with water, on sod walls when possible, believing it reduced dampness and disease. Whether it truly helped is debated, but the intent mattered. People weren't ignorant of health risks. They just worked with limited options. Bathing becomes rare and strategic. You wash hands and face when you can. Full immersion is a luxury reserved for warmer days. But interestingly, illness doesn't spike the way you might expect. Exposure kills faster than grime. That's the quiet calculus of winter on the plains. You also notice something unexpected. Underground injuries heal differently. Cuts stay cleaner, oddly enough. Less wind-driven debris, fewer contaminants. The stable temperature helps. Infections don't disappear, but they don't explode either. Everything moves slowly underground, including bacteria. Scholars still argue over this point. Some suggest the relative isolation of underground life limited exposure to contagious illness. Others counter that crowded conditions, especially with animals, should have made things worse. Both are true at different times. Context mattered more than structure. You think about families who lived 6, 7 people in a single dugout room for months. No ventilation errors, no space, no privacy. From a modern perspective, it sounds like a health nightmare. And sometimes it was, but sometimes everyone made it through while better-built cabins nearby lost occupants to cold or exposure. Health here isn't absolute, it's comparative. Hygiene also becomes psychological. Order matters more when space is limited. You keep tools in the same place, food stored carefully, waste managed consistently. Disorder underground feels dangerous, even if it's not immediately so. Clean lines of movement reduce accidents, reduce stress. There's a historical fact that surprises many people. Sod houses were often described as quiet and calming by their occupants. That calm reduced stress, which modern science now links to immune function. Frontier settlers didn't know that, but they felt it. Of course, parasites were a concern. Insects found their way into everything once temperatures rose even slightly. Lice, fleas, mites, these were common everywhere on the frontier, underground or not. The difference was visibility. Underground, you couldn't ignore them. People responded with constant cleaning, boiling fabric, smoking out spaces when weather allowed. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether sod living shortened average lifespans. Some early 20th century studies suggested it did. More recent analyses question those conclusions, noting that poverty, malnutrition, and isolation played larger roles than housing type alone. In other words, dirt walls weren't the villain, winter was. You evaluate your own body quietly. You're thinner. That's undeniable. Food scarcity does that. But you're also more stable. Your joints ache less than they did in the biting cold above ground. You sleep deeper. Your pulse feels steady. That steadiness counts for something. There's a fringe belief from the era that underground living drew sickness out of the body by keeping people warm and still. It's not medical science, but warmth does support recovery. The belief reflects lived experience more than superstition. You also think about children raised underground. Some doctors worried about lack of sunlight. Others noted strong bones from constant physical work and stable nutrition when available. Again, no simple answers. The frontier rarely offered those. Hygiene debates didn't stop people from digging. Survival settled the argument every winter. Whatever underground life took, it gave back something far more immediate: continuity. As spring approaches, you plan for cleansing, not ritual, but practical. Airing out bedding, letting sunlight reach the walls, scraping and drying everything possible. Underground spaces weren't abandoned at winter's end, they were reset. Many settlers kept their dugouts long after cabins were built, using them as cellars, shelters, and sick rooms. That alone says something about trust. You don't discard what saved you. You realize that health underground was never about ideal conditions. It was about choosing the least damaging option available. Cold killed quickly. Dampness worked slowly. People chose slow when they could. That choice echoes through history. Basements, root cellars, storm shelters, all inherit this same logic. Modern materials hide the dirt, but the principle remains unchanged. As you sit quietly, breathing air that smells faintly of earth and smoke, you don't feel unhealthy. You feel adapted, adjusted, tuned to a narrower but survivable range. Underground living didn't make pioneers stronger or weaker in any simple way. It made them functional under conditions that punished idealism. And in the Wild West, functionality wasn't just a virtue. It was the difference between spring and silence. As winter loosens its grip just enough to breathe, another realization settles in. One that's been there all along, quietly ignored until survival forced your attention. None of this underground knowledge is new. You didn't invent it. You rediscovered it. And long before settlers arrived shivering on the plains, others already knew exactly where to go when the sky turned hostile. You start thinking about indigenous tribes who lived here for generations before homesteads cut the land into squares. Tribes like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara built earth lodges. Large, circular, partially underground homes with thick soil walls and central fire pits. They weren't emergency shelters. They were permanent, intentional architecture designed for this exact climate. Historical fact: some of these earth lodges were over 40 feet in diameter, housing extended families through brutal winters with remarkable efficiency. thick earthen walls insulated against cold and heat alike. Carefully designed smoke holes managed airflow. The ground did most of the work. Settlers saw these structures. They wrote about them. Some dismissed them as primitive. Others quietly took notes. There's an uncomfortable truth historians still wrestle with. Much of what kept pioneers alive was borrowed, sometimes knowingly, sometimes indirectly, from indigenous survival strategies. Underground living wasn't a stroke of frontier ingenuity, so much as a reluctant admission that the land had already taught its lessons to someone else. At first, many settlers resisted that idea. They arrived with European assumptions about houses needing height, visibility, separation from soil. Living underground felt like regression, like giving up progress. That mindset cost lives. You feel that resistance echoing in your own early choices. How long you clung to the idea of an above-ground cabin. How digging felt like defeat instead of adaptation. That wasn't personal pride, it was cultural inheritance. Indigenous knowledge emphasized something settlers struggled with: cooperation with the environment rather than dominance over it. Earth lodges didn't fight winter. They absorbed it. They didn't try to stay visible through storms. They disappeared until conditions improved. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much direct knowledge transfer occurred between native tribes and settlers. Some historians argue settlers rarely learned directly, citing prejudice and conflict. Others point to undeniable overlaps in design, placement, and technique that suggest observation and imitation, even if unacknowledged. From your perspective, intent matters less than outcome. The techniques worked. And once survival was on the line, ideology softened. You think about how indigenous communities oriented their lodges, often facing away from prevailing winds, partially banked into terrain, clustered for shared protection. You see echoes of that now in settler dugouts scattered across hillsides, entrances angled carefully, structures grouped where possible. There's a fringe but compelling argument among some scholars that the Great Plains forced a kind of cultural convergence. Regardless of origin, anyone who stayed long enough learned the same lessons. Go low, go thick, manage air, respect wind. You feel that convergence in your own body, the way you now read weather through pressure and sound instead of sight, the way you prioritize ground temperature over sunlight. These aren't learned from manuals. They're learned from living long enough to notice patterns. It's also impossible to ignore the irony. Many settlers violently displaced native tribes whose architectural wisdom they later relied on to survive. Earth lodges were abandoned or destroyed, then reimagined under different names by new occupants facing the same climate. That contradiction sits heavy when you think about it. Survival knowledge outlived the societies that refined it. The ground kept the lesson, even when people refused to. Indigenous winter living wasn't just about structures, it was about rhythm, seasonal movement, knowing when to stay and when to go. Settlers, tied to fixed land claims, lost that flexibility. Underground shelters became a substitute for mobility, a way to endure when you couldn't leave. You realize that dugouts are, in a sense, stationary burrows, a compromise between nomadic adaptation and permanent settlement. Not ideal, but functional enough to bridge worlds. There's a documented fact that some native guides advised settlers to build into hillsides or use earth banks during winter. Whether settlers followed that advice consistently is debated. Pride often interfered. But when storms proved unforgiving, advice once ignored suddenly sounded practical. You think about how knowledge moves under pressure. It doesn't travel politely. It doesn't wait for acknowledgement. It gets copied, repurposed, renamed. Survival doesn't care who figured it out first. Still, the loss matters. The erasure matters. Earth lodges weren't just shelters. They were cultural centers, spiritual spaces, places of memory. Dugouts copied the form, but not the meaning. They preserved bodies, not traditions. Living underground, you sense that absence. The space feels functional, not sacred. It keeps you alive, but it doesn't anchor you to history the way those lodges anchored entire communities. That difference shows up in how settlers treat underground space, as temporary, embarrassing, something to leave behind when real houses become possible. Indigenous earth lodges were homes first, shelters second. There's debate among anthropologists about whether this difference affected mental resilience. A home designed with cultural meaning may sustain more than one built-in fear. You can't test that easily, but you feel the distinction intuitively. Still, necessity has a way of leveling judgment. Underground, you stop caring where an idea came from. You care whether it works, and it does. As spring approaches, you find yourself planning improvements that mirror ancient designs: better airflow, more stable shapes, deeper insulation. You didn't set out to imitate anyone. You just followed logic until it led you there. You imagine what winter must have felt like in a full earth lodge. Voices echoing softly, firelight reflecting off packed walls, children sleeping while storms raged overhead. Not hidden, but sheltered. Not waiting desperately, but living continuously. That image reframes your own experience. Underground living doesn't have to mean fear and retreat. It can mean continuity, if the structure is built with intention instead of urgency. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether settlers would have adopted earth-sheltered architecture more fully if cultural barriers hadn't existed. Would towns have looked different? Would winter mortality have dropped sooner? It's impossible to know, but the potential was there. You sit quietly, hand resting against the dirt wall, and acknowledge the lineage of this knowledge. You didn't invent it. You inherited it through observation, necessity, and survival. The land didn't teach you alone. It taught many before you. You're just the latest to listen closely enough. As wind moves gently above, no longer threatening, you feel a strange sense of humility settle in. Underground living stripped away illusions of novelty and ownership. It revealed how small human innovation really is when stacked against climate and time. What saved you wasn't toughness or destiny. It was alignment, with physics, with geography, with lessons written into the land long before fences arrived. You don't romanticize that realization. You accept it. Survival rarely flatters pride. As the season turns, you know you'll carry this knowledge forward, not as a trick or a secret, but as an understanding. When the land demands adaptation, resistance is optional. Learning is not. Underground, you learned what others already knew. When winter comes without mercy, the safest place isn't above the world trying to face it. It's inside the earth, letting it do what it has always done best. As winter finally begins to fracture instead of dominate, you notice a strange illusion forming across the plains. From a distance, everything looks abandoned. Chimneys poke from snow like forgotten markers. Fences vanish. Roads dissolve. Anyone passing through might assume the land has been emptied of people entirely. And yet, beneath the surface, life continues quietly. This is when you realize something that feels almost secret. At the height of winter, entire towns effectively went underground. Not literally in every case, but functionally. Families retreated into dugouts. Businesses shut their doors and waited below. Schools closed or moved into basements. Churches fell silent until spring. Above ground, nothing moved. Below ground, breathing, waiting, enduring continued. Historical records from particularly harsh winters describe towns that appeared deserted for weeks at a time. Mail routes stopped, travel ceased. Smoke was the only sign of human presence, rising faintly from holes in the snow. Some communities didn't officially function again until thaw, but they never truly disappeared. You imagine walking across such a town without knowing, stepping over roofs buried deep, crossing streets that exist only in memory, people living inches beneath your boots, hearing muffled footsteps above, but unable to emerge. This wasn't theory. It happened. There are documented cases from the late 19th century where travelers unknowingly crossed snow-covered towns, mistaking them for open prairie. Only later did they learn they'd walked over occupied homes. The land had swallowed visibility completely. You understand now why underground living changed how communities related to each other. Social life condensed. Interaction happened only when necessary. News traveled slowly and selectively. People emerged briefly to exchange information, then vanished again below. This forced compression altered town dynamics. Gossip faded, conflict cooled, survival narrowed priorities so sharply that only essential cooperation remained. There was little energy left for disagreement when simply staying warm demanded constant attention. Scholars debate whether this seasonal disappearance weakened community bonds or strengthened them. Some argue isolation eroded social cohesion. Others suggest shared endurance forged deeper, quieter connections. The truth likely depended on how evenly hardship was distributed. From underground, everyone looked the same. You feel that leveling effect yourself. Status means nothing here. Land size doesn't matter. Appearance doesn't matter. Only preparation, awareness, and patience count. Underground, hierarchy collapses into function. Towns adapted to this rhythm in subtle ways. Supplies were stockpiled earlier. Winter schedules shortened. Expectations shifted. Some communities even planned winter underground life deliberately, treating it as a predictable phase rather than an emergency. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether the Great Plains briefly flirted with a semi-subterranean culture during its harshest settlement years. While permanent underground towns never fully materialized, the seasonal pattern suggests a partial shift, one driven by climate rather than ideology. You see echoes of this in later architecture. Basements became standard, storm cellars ubiquitous, root cellars essential. The idea that part of life should exist below ground never left. It just became normalized. Underground winter living also changed how people thought about visibility. Being seen wasn't always desirable. Being exposed wasn't brave. During winter, safety was invisibility. Communities learned to disappear together. There's a strange comfort in that collective retreat. You're not alone in hiding. Everyone is doing the same thing, even if you can't see them. That shared absence becomes its own form of connection. You think about how this contrasts with frontier mythology, the lone homesteader standing tall against the elements. That image collapses in winter. Survival wasn't loud or defiant. It was quiet, buried, and cooperative in its own understated way. There's a fringe but fascinating idea among some historians that winter underground living temporarily reversed the frontier's obsession with expansion. Growth paused, movement stopped. The land dictated stillness. People adapted by shrinking their footprint rather than pushing outward. You feel that contraction personally. Your world has reduced to a few cubic yards of earth. And yet, within that small space, life continues fully. Thought, memory, care, effort. Size stops correlating with significance. When storms finally space out and daylight stretches longer, towns don't immediately reappear. Emergence is gradual. One chimney uncovered, one path cleared, one voice heard above ground. Reanimation takes time. That transition can be disorienting. People emerge pale, cautious, slower than before. Eyes squint in the light. Movements feel exposed. It's like surfacing after a long dive. You recognize that feeling. The underground world trained your senses for different priorities. Above ground, everything feels loud and excessive at first. Wind feels intrusive. Space feels unprotected. Communities adjusted together. No one rushed. Work resumed carefully. Social life restarted in fragments. The town stitched itself back into visibility piece by piece. There's a historical account from a plain settlement describing spring as the season of reappearing. That phrase sticks with you. Winter didn't end life. It hit it. You realize now that underground living wasn't just individual survival. It was communal strategy. A way for entire settlements to pause without breaking, to endure without constant loss. That strategy influenced migration patterns too. People who survived underground winters were more likely to stay long-term. Those who refused often left or didn't make it. Over time, the plains selected for those willing to disappear when necessary. This selection shaped the culture quietly. Pragmatism over pride, preparation over performance. These values didn't make headlines, but they built permanence. You sit underground during one of the last cold nights, aware that above you, others are doing the same. a scattered network of people breathing quietly beneath the prairie, waiting for permission to surface. That image feels strangely modern, like a hidden system humming beneath a calm exterior. You wonder how many future generations would unknowingly inherit this instinct. Go below when danger passes overhead. Tornado shelters, bomb shelters, basements during storms. The logic persists. Visibility isn't safety, protection is. There's an open scholarly debate about whether these winter underground habits influenced American attitudes toward risk and preparedness more broadly. It's hard to draw a straight line, but the behavior remains. When things turn hostile, people still seek the earth. As dawn creeps in later each morning and winter loosens its hold, you prepare for emergence, not because you're eager, but because systems demand transition. Underground life is seasonal. It holds you through extremes, not forever. You make notes, mental ones. What worked? What didn't? Where you'd dig deeper next time? Where you'd reinforce sooner? These lessons feel permanent now. When you finally step above ground for longer stretches, you don't feel triumphant. You feel calibrated, tuned. The land didn't defeat you, it instructed you. And underground, you learned how entire communities survived by agreeing, implicitly, quietly, to step out of sight together until the danger passed. Winter on the plains didn't end towns. It taught them how to vanish without dying, and how to return when the sky finally allowed it. When spring finally asserts itself with confidence, it doesn't arrive all at once. It tests boundaries first. Warm afternoons followed by cruel nights, melting snow that refreezes into treacherous crusts. You've learned not to trust early signals. But something else changes too, something quieter and more decisive. Technology begins to creep back into relevance. Winter on the plains has a way of stripping life down to fundamentals. Underground, technology barely matters. Fire, earth, breath, that's the system. But as storms weaken and daylight stretches, tools regain power. And over the years, those tools slowly began replacing the need to disappear beneath the soil. You see it in small things first. Better stoves that burn longer and cleaner, reducing smoke and oxygen drain. Iron components replacing fragile wood. Windows designed to seal tighter. These aren't luxuries. They're incremental defenses against the same forces that drove people underground in the first place. Historically, the spread of cast iron stoves in the late 19th century dramatically improved winter survival rates. They radiated heat more evenly and required less constant tending. For people in cabins, this mattered enormously. Heat became controllable instead of fleeting. Railroads mattered even more. Once supply lines stayed open longer into winter, isolation loosened its grip. Fuel could arrive, food shortages eased. People still faced storms, but they faced them with margins instead of absolutes. Weather forecasting, rudimentary as it was, also changed behavior. Telegraph reports allowed warnings to travel faster than storms themselves. The blizzard of 1888 accelerated this shift dramatically. People demanded notice. Even a few hours could mean the difference between being caught above ground and being safely below it. You feel this shift conceptually, even if you're not benefiting from it directly yet. The underground shelter that once felt essential begins to feel optional. Still wise, still useful, but no longer the only answer. The ground remains a fallback instead of a default. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these technologies truly replaced underground living or merely layered over it. Many historians argue that even as cabins improved, underground spaces persisted quietly, used as backups, cellars, storm shelters. The practice didn't vanish, it evolved. You know that's true because you're already thinking that way. You don't plan to abandon your dugout when conditions improve. You plan to integrate it. Storage, emergency shelter, thermal buffer. The ground earned its place. Communities shifted similarly. Towns invested in better construction, but they also dug deeper basements. They built storm cellars into public buildings. They accepted that no amount of technology could fully tame the plains, only negotiate with them more efficiently. There's a quirky historical note from this transition period. Some settlers installed stoves underground first, testing new technology in the safest environment they had. If it worked there, it was trusted above ground. Innovation filtered upward. Psychologically, this technological shift changed attitudes too. People felt less helpless, less reactive. Preparedness replaced resignation. Underground living had taught patience. Technology added confidence. But confidence came with a cost. Over-reliance crept in. Some people trusted new tools too much, assuming machines would save them where judgment once ruled. Historians point to a brief spike in winter accidents during this transition, moments when people delayed retreat because they believed technology would hold. You recognize that temptation, the idea that you might not need to go underground next time, that you might ride out a storm above just to prove you can. Experience tempers that impulse quickly. You've learned that underground isn't a failure mode, it's a safety margin. Technology reduces risk, it doesn't erase it. As spring firms up, you spend more time above ground repairing, rebuilding, planning. The underground space stays ready but unused for longer stretches. You don't feel the urge to seal yourself in every time the wind shifts. That's progress of a sort. There's a broader historical debate about whether technological improvements fundamentally changed the relationship between settlers and the plains. Some argue they did, that machines allowed humans to impose order where none existed before. Others argue the environment still dictated outcomes, just with more intermediaries. From where you stand, shovel in hand, dirt still under your nails, the answer feels obvious. The plains didn't become gentler. People just learned how to buffer their exposure. Underground living was the most extreme buffer, total withdrawal. Technology offered partial ones, walls instead of soil, stoves instead of body heat, forecasts instead of intuition. Each reduced reliance on the earth without eliminating it. You think about how future generations will interpret this period. They'll see underground homes as oddities, survival hacks, footnotes. They won't feel the desperation that made them necessary, but they will inherit the architecture of caution they inspired. Basements will feel normal, storm shelters expected, preparedness praised quietly rather than dramatically. These are cultural residues of winters when hiding underground was the only rational choice. As you dismantle some winter reinforcements and let sunlight reach places it hasn't in months, you feel neither regret nor nostalgia. Underground living wasn't an identity. It was a response. Technology may reduce the need to vanish beneath the plains, but it doesn't erase the lesson. When systems fail, when forecasts miss, when fuel runs out, the ground is still there. Patient, insulating, ready. You realize that progress on the frontier didn't mean abandoning old solutions. It meant stacking them, layering new tools atop ancient principles. Earth below, fire within, judgment above. As the season turns decisively and green finally pushes through thawed soil, you don't rush to forget winter. You catalog it, you store it mentally, alongside tools and techniques. Because next year, the plains won't care what technology you trust. They'll care whether you remembered where safety lives when the sky decides to turn hostile again. Even as spring takes hold and life expands back above ground, you notice something unexpected. Not everyone is eager to leave the earth behind. Some people linger underground longer than necessary. Some never fully abandon it at all. What began as survival has for a few turned into preference. You hear about neighbors who rebuilt cabins but kept sleeping below during cold snaps. Families who used their dugouts year-round, adding simple comforts instead of sealing them up. It's not because they lack options. It's because underground living changed how they define safety, and comfort follows safety. There's a documented historical reality behind this. In several plains regions, sod houses and dugouts continued to be occupied well into the early 20th century, long after lumber and rail access improved. Officials often criticized this, framing underground homes as symbols of poverty or backwardness. The people living in them quietly disagreed. Underground spaces stayed cool in summer, stable in storms, quiet in wind. Once you experienced that consistency, drafty cabins felt wasteful, even reckless. Comfort wasn't about appearance, it was about predictability. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about why some settlers chose to remain underground. One argument suggests economics. Earth was free, lumber expensive. Another points to psychology. After years of threat, people trusted what had already proven itself. A third argues climate logic alone made the decision rational. The truth likely blends all three. You understand all of them. You feel it during a sudden late spring cold snap. The temperature drops sharply overnight, catching many people off guard. Cabins creak, stoves struggle. You retreat underground without hesitation. The space welcomes you back like it never forgot its purpose. That ease surprises you. Going underground doesn't feel like retreat anymore. It feels like switching modes, like choosing the right gear for conditions. No drama, no pride involved. Some settlers described this feeling explicitly in letters, writing that they felt foolish for fighting the earth when it offered such obvious protection. Others admitted they slept better underground even when above-ground conditions were fine. Silence and stability are addictive once you've relied on them long enough. There's a quirky frontier detail tied to this. A few settlers decorated their dugouts more carefully than their cabins, adding shelves, rugs, even crude artwork. If you're going to spend months somewhere, you make it livable. That simple truth reshapes priorities. You find yourself doing the same, organizing, improving, personalizing. Not because you expect to stay underground forever, but because you respect it enough to treat it as real living space, not just a bunker. This shift unsettles outsiders. Visitors comment on how low and dark the space feels. They stand hunched, uncomfortable. You recognize that posture. It's how you felt once. To them, underground is constraint. To you, it's shelter. Anthropologists debate whether this represents adaptation or accommodation. Did people truly prefer underground living, or were they simply shaped by hardship into accepting less? It's a difficult line to draw. Preference formed under pressure isn't always voluntary, but it's still real. You know this much. Underground living changed your nervous system. You relax more quickly here. Your body expects fewer surprises. Above ground, you stay alert by default. Below, vigilance narrows to manageable parameters. That physiological response matters. You think about modern parallels without realizing it. People choosing basements during storms, preferring interior rooms, seeking quieter enclosed spaces when overwhelmed. The instinct doesn't vanish with technology, it just gets new names. Some settlers never fully trusted above-ground homes again. They built cabins over dugouts, treating the surface structure as expendable and the underground space as essential. If the roof blew off, life continued below. That logic feels sound to you. Redundancy isn't pessimism, it's resilience. There's also a cultural undercurrent here. Underground living stripped away performative aspects of settlement. No one admired your house, no one judged its size. What mattered was whether it worked. For some people, that simplicity was freeing. You feel a trace of that freedom yourself. No facade, no expectations, just function. It's oddly peaceful. As summer approaches, insects drive you above ground more often. Heat builds, moisture becomes harder to manage below. Underground retreats naturally into secondary status, but it doesn't disappear. It becomes a tool you know how to use, not a place you fear. Scholars argue that this is the true legacy of underground living on the plains, not permanent subterranean towns, but a permanent shift in how people evaluated shelter. Safety first, visibility second. You pack away winter gear, but you don't dismantle supports. You don't fill in shafts, you keep entrances clear. Experience taught you better than that. The ground earned your trust. One evening, as a summer storm rolls in, violent but brief, you choose to wait it out underground out of habit. The rain hammers uselessly above. Thunder booms, muted and distant. You sit comfortably, almost amused at how little it affects you now. That's when you realize why some people never left. Underground living didn't just save them in winter. It recalibrated their relationship with the world above. Above ground became optional. Underground became assurance. As the storm passes and you step back into fresh air, you don't feel trapped or diminished. You feel equipped. You have layers now, choices. That's the real evolution. The Wild West didn't end underground living by replacing it. It absorbed it. And long after sod houses vanished from maps and photographs, the instinct they sharpened remained, quietly guiding people back to the earth whenever the sky reminded them who was really in charge. By the time winter finally releases the plains completely, you're left with something heavier than memory. It's understanding. Not the kind you read about or pass along neatly, but the kind that settles into your posture, your instincts, the way you scan a horizon without thinking. The ground taught you something fundamental, and it's a lesson that doesn't stay in the past. You realize that underground living wasn't just a historical curiosity or a desperate frontier tactic. It was a case study in how humans survive extremes when systems fail. Strip away technology, supply chains, forecasts, and comfort, and the solution that remains is remarkably old. Use the earth. That truth hasn't aged out. You start noticing modern echoes everywhere. Basements as default architecture, storm cellars in tornado country, subways doubling as shelters during war, bunkers, panic rooms, safe rooms, all variations on the same instinct. When danger becomes overwhelming, humans go down. There's a historical fact that surprises a lot of people. Many early 20th century disaster planners explicitly referenced frontier dugouts and earth shelters when designing civilian protection strategies. They didn't frame it as nostalgia, they framed it as physics. Earth absorbs energy, Earth stabilizes temperature, Earth blocks wind, fire, and force. The pioneers didn't know the equations, but they lived the results. You think about how modern life encourages the opposite impulse. Build higher, see farther, be visible, open layouts, glass walls. These ideas work until conditions turn hostile. Then the calculus flips instantly. Visibility becomes exposure. Height becomes liability. That's the lesson the plains delivered brutally and repeatedly. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether humanity cycles between surface-focused living and earth-sheltered living in response to environmental stress. Some argue climate volatility will drive renewed interest in underground architecture. Others say technology will always outpace the need. The frontier experience suggests something simpler. When margins disappear, people revert to what works. You carry that forward mentally. You don't assume the future will be gentler than the past. You don't assume systems will always function. Underground living taught you to respect fallback solutions, the ones that don't rely on timing, coordination, or external support. It also taught you humility. The Wild West is often framed as a triumph of human will over nature, but underground survival tells a different story. It wasn't victory, it was concession. People survived by admitting they couldn't outmuscle the environment and by adjusting accordingly. That mindset is quietly radical. You think about how many lives were saved not by strength or bravery, but by timing, by being underground before the storm arrived. Survival favored those who anticipated instead of reacted, those who accepted temporary invisibility over permanent exposure. That principle applies far beyond blizzards. There's a fringe but increasingly discussed idea among modern historians and resilience researchers that pioneer underground living represents one of the earliest examples of adaptive resilience. Systems designed not to prevent disaster, but to absorb it without catastrophic loss. Dugouts didn't stop storms, they made storms survivable. That's a powerful distinction. You notice how that lesson has threaded itself into modern thinking without much fanfare. Resilience planning, redundancy, backup systems, fail-safes. None of these concepts aim for perfection. They aim for continuity. Underground living was continuity in its rawest form. The ground didn't make life easy, it made life possible. As you reflect, you realize something else. Underground survival rewrote the definition of success for an entire generation. Success wasn't thriving year-round. It was making it to spring, again and again, quietly, without collapse. That recalibration shaped culture. People who endured winters underground valued preparation over showmanship, function over form. Those values lingered long after sod houses vanished. embedding themselves in regional attitudes toward risk and practicality. You can still feel that legacy today in how certain regions talk about weather, disaster, and preparedness. Less bravado, more planning, more respect for what the land can do when it decides not to negotiate. The pioneers didn't just hide underground, they learned when hiding was wisdom. You realize that's the most transferable lesson of all. Modern life often frames retreat as failure, stepping back as weakness. But the plains taught a different ethic. Retreat can be strategy. Withdrawal can preserve capacity. Visibility isn't always virtue. Underground living embodied that truth physically. It asked people to lower themselves, literally, to survive. That posture matters. It changes how you think about dominance, progress, and control. There's an open debate among scholars about whether societies that internalize this lesson handle crises better. Do cultures that value fallback spaces, redundancy, and patience recover faster? The frontier suggests yes, but not without cost. Humility isn't glamorous. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't sell easily. But it works. As you mentally step back from your own underground space, you understand that what you learned wasn't about dirt walls or sod roofs. It was about alignment, aligning behavior with environment, aligning expectations with reality, aligning survival strategies with physics instead of pride. The pioneers who survived deadly winter storms in the Wild West didn't do so by conquering the plains. They did it by letting the plains dictate terms, and then choosing the smartest possible response. Sometimes that response was a shovel, sometimes it was patience, sometimes it was the willingness to vanish until conditions changed. Those lessons don't belong to the 19th century. They belong to anyone facing an environment that doesn't care about plans or narratives. Climate extremes, supply disruptions, natural disasters, the variables change, the logic doesn't. Go where danger loses strength. Reduce exposure instead of escalating resistance. Build systems that forgive mistakes instead of punishing them. The Earth did that for pioneers when nothing else could. As you sit with that realization, you feel the story settle, not as nostalgia, but as instruction. The ground doesn't ask to be remembered. It just waits, doing what it has always done, buffering chaos, slowing extremes, giving humans a place to endure when the surface becomes untenable. That's why pioneers hid underground. Not because they were afraid, but because they were paying attention. And in the end, attention, more than toughness, more than technology, is what carried them through winters that killed the unprepared. The Wild West didn't teach survival through domination. It taught survival through knowing exactly when to step aside, go low, and let the storm exhaust itself above you. That lesson is still there, waiting, quietly, just beneath the surface. When you finally begin living mostly above ground again, the Earth doesn't disappear from your awareness. It lingers like a quiet presence in the back of your mind, a known solution you hope not to need but will never forget. Every time the wind sharpens unexpectedly or clouds flatten into that familiar, ominous gray, you feel the old instinct stir. Where's the ground? That instinct didn't fade for pioneers either. Even after winters ended, even after technology improved, people carried an internal map of safety beneath their feet. The underground became psychological as much as physical, a reassurance that danger had limits. You see it in behavior. People no longer wander far without checking the weather. They watch wind more closely. They mark terrain differently. Hillsides aren't just scenery, they're potential shelter. Soil depth isn't abstract, it's insurance. There's a historical fact that supports this shift. Settlers who survived multiple severe winters were statistically more likely to build storm cellars, reinforced basements, or hybrid earth-sheltered homes later, even when materials allowed otherwise. Survival experience permanently altered design priorities. The land trained them. You realize that underground living didn't just teach where to go during danger, it taught when to stop pushing forward. That lesson is harder to learn and easier to forget. The frontier myth celebrates relentless motion. Westward, upward, outward. Winter punished that impulse brutally. Underground, momentum halts, time stretches, action pauses, and paradoxically, that pause preserves life. There's an ongoing debate among cultural historians about whether frontier winters slowed American expansion more than any political or economic force. Some argue winters merely delayed settlement. Others suggest they fundamentally shaped settlement patterns by selecting for patience over aggression. Underground living sits at the center of that argument. You can feel why. Living below ground strips away the illusion of urgency. There's nothing you can rush, nothing you can force. The storm sets the timeline. You respond, or you don't survive. That recalibration doesn't disappear once winter ends. It stays embedded in decision-making. People who learned to wait underground became slower to gamble above ground, slower to assume conditions would remain stable, more likely to build margins. You see this in how pioneers approached future risks: fire, drought, flood. They planned escapes earlier, stored more than they needed, accepted that retreat didn't negate progress, it preserved it. Underground living also reshaped how people understood failure. A collapsed cabin wasn't the end. A buried entrance wasn't defeat. As long as the underground space held, recovery was possible. That flexibility mattered enormously in a landscape where rebuilding was constant. You notice how differently you think now when something goes wrong. Instead of escalating, working harder, pushing longer, you look for containment, stabilization, a way to reduce exposure until conditions improve. That's the underground mindset. There's a fringe theory among resilience researchers that this mindset, learned through repeated environmental stress, creates cultures that favor durability over speed. The plains may have seeded that preference quietly through winters that punished haste without mercy. You think about how this applies beyond weather: economic downturns, social upheaval, personal crises. The instinct to go underground, to shrink your world temporarily, preserve resources, wait out volatility, appears again and again in human behavior. It's not cowardice, it's calibration. The pioneers who hid underground weren't opting out of frontier life. They were choosing to remain alive long enough to continue it. That distinction matters. You realize now that underground living taught a lesson. Modern life often resists. Not every problem is solved by engagement. Some are solved by withdrawal, by creating distance, by letting forces burn themselves out. Winter storms didn't care how much effort you applied. They only cared where you were when they peaked. That reality simplifies decision-making in a way few experiences can. Underground living removed ambiguity. Either you were protected or you weren't. As seasons cycle forward, you don't romanticize the underground anymore. You don't miss it, but you respect it. It remains a reference point, a baseline for understanding risk. You measure future threats against that standard. Is this worse than winter on the plains? Does it demand retreat, or can it be managed in the open? Those questions guide you quietly, shaping choices without fanfare. The Wild West didn't just leave behind ghost towns and legends. It left behind instincts. Instincts forged by cold, wind, and the humility of digging into the earth because nothing else worked. You carry those instincts forward now, whether you realize it or not. Every time you value preparedness over pride, every time you choose shelter over spectacle, every time you recognize that survival sometimes means becoming smaller, quieter, and harder to reach. Those are underground lessons. And as you stand above ground now, sun higher, grass returning, life resuming, you know exactly where you'd go if the sky darkened and the temperature dropped without warning. You wouldn't hesitate. You'd go where the storm loses its teeth, where time slows enough to survive, where generations before you learned the hard way that sometimes the smartest move isn't forward, it's down.